Seduction, Shifters Forever Worlds. Written by Elle Thorne. Narrated by Megan Kelly. Chapter 1. Brr, brr, brr. Astra ignored it, wouldn't even look at it. Nope, not once. She'd promised herself tonight would be a night off. She shoved her hair away from her face and thought again about cutting her long blonde locks. But there was no way she would do short hair. It didn't suit her. Maybe if she was a little bit smaller. She bit back a laugh. She would never be a little bit smaller, and she loved her body just fine. By damn, she loved the curves she'd been blessed with. Hell yeah, curves were in. Brr, brr, brr. Astra stirred the pasta instead of looking at the phone. The stupid cell phone vibrated again. Though she couldn't see it and wouldn't look at it, she could hear it clattering loud against the wood of the table. Wow, someone is way too persistent. She was looking forward to a night of spaghetti and a movie. She'd DVR'd the movie last week and hadn't had a chance to check it out yet. She'd spent the last few days helping ranchers and pet owners, being called to assist with problem deliveries, wounded animals. Not that she didn't love her job, she did. She enjoyed training to be a vet. But she needed a minute off. Okay, maybe more than a minute. Brr, brr, brr. The phone vibrated on the table again. She bit back a curse word. Why couldn't they call another vet assistant? She picked up the phone and turned it over so she could see the screen. It wasn't someone looking for veterinary help. She couldn't resist the smile that crept onto her face. Grant, her favorite uncle. More like her favorite shifter, except she didn't like shifters at all. Well, her stepdad and Grant were the only shifters she liked, the only ones she knew, too. Who could blame her for hating shifters, though? Enemy shifters had killed her mother, leaving Astra to be raised by Doc. She tapped on the screen to answer it. Hi, Grant. Chelsea didn't get bonked on the head again, did she? Astra liked Grant's woman, Chelsea. Had liked her since the moment she'd met her, a little over a month ago. No. The smile on Grant's face could be heard in his voice. But I was hoping to get Doc to pay us a visit. Not an emergency, but his services are needed. Astra squealed out loud. Then she clamped a hand over her mouth. She hadn't planned to lose control that way. Doc was a doctor, a people doctor, not an aspiring animal doctor like Astra. Could this mean... Chelsea's not pregnant, is she? Excitement was hard to hide when it came to Grant and Chelsea having a baby. Grant laughed, the sound welcome in Astra's tired ear. Hey now, we're not rushing that part. Still planning the wedding. Astra laughed too. She knew that. In fact, she was going to be in the wedding. Chelsea had asked her to be the maid of honor. May was supposed to be the matron of honor. Astra hadn't heard what they were going to wear yet, but she hoped it wasn't one of those god-awful colors that bridesmaids' dresses seem to always be. Well, Doc's out of town. Did he not answer his cell? Grant was silent on the other end. That set alarms off for Chelsea. She wasn't sure what kind of alarms, because he didn't seem panicked or anything like that, but still, his silence spoke volumes. Maybe I'm overreacting. I was just going to sit down to dinner. She didn't mention the movie part because she didn't want Grant to feel guilty if he had to pull her away from it. I'll put it aside and eat later. She heard Grant saying something. It was muffled, though, as if he'd put his hand over the mic. Then she heard Chelsea's voice in the background. Hey, Astra! Chelsea. Clearly, Chelsea had either taken the phone from Grant or he'd handed it to her. Why don't you bring whatever you cooked over, and we'll do a potluck thing? May's here, too. Now the signals were really going off in Astra's head. What was May doing there? Why did they need medical attention? And why had Grant hesitated when she'd asked him if he'd called Doc? Chapter 2. Kane Ortiz glanced from Grant to Chelsea, back to Grant, and finally to May.
What am I missing? Who's Astra?
She's Doc Evans' daughter, stepdaughter. May corrected herself. Doc's out of town. Astra's coming over. She can check you out.
I'm fine. I've mostly healed.
Kane frowned at the three of them. There was an undertow he didn't understand. He appreciated May's overprotectiveness, but he wasn't a child.
Jeez.
He was full-grown, more than a century and a half old, for fuck's sake. He ran a hand over his stubble. The several days of growth was itchy. Grant frowned back at him, a look of concern underlying the frown.
A shifter bite? Certain shifter bites. Those are altogether different from a regular wound. They can create issues. Just let her check.
Kane nodded. Grant had said Kane could stay in one of his cabins, and Kane could acquiesce to a little examination in exchange for that. Especially since Kane had to stay off the grid and lie low. He felt guilty not telling May everything, but he pushed the guilt away. Sometimes knowledge could prove dangerous to others. It was best he just mind his own business, stay off the radar, let things settle, and then move on. He was a nomad anyway, with no interest in putting roots down. In spite of his nomadic ways, though, he didn't want to bring trouble to these nice people who would give him a place to stay, if only for a while. He inhaled deeply, and his stomach roiled from hunger. The dinner they'd put together was tempting. He'd hardly eaten anything in 3 days, traveling only at night, wearing scent blocks so he couldn't be scented, always in bear form so he could hear and sense other shifters. Kane cleared his throat to drown out the sound of his stomach's rumbling.
Grant, I sure appreciate you letting me stay in one of your cabins. No problem. It's our way. We help each other out.
Grant smiled at May. Kane wondered about that smile. It was as if they shared a secret. May patted Grant's shoulder.
It's nice to have shifters in the valley again. It's been lonely.
Kane wanted to correct her, to tell her his plan was to be here only for a short time, but he didn't have the heart to do that. She seemed so happy, and there was a gleam in her eye. Then he remembered he had a question for Grant.
Could I ask one thing? And I hate to be a pain in the
May coughed. Kane looked at her, then Chelsea.
Oops. Shit.
He'd almost said ass.
I'm sorry. I was saying, I hate to be a pain, but is there any possibility for me to put in a request? Sure.
Grant put an arm around Chelsea and planted a kiss on her temple, on a spot where a tiny crescent-shaped scar remained from what looked like a recent wound. Chelsea smiled back at him, leaning her curvy body against his. Kane bit back the shot of envy that coursed through him. What the hell was wrong with him? Domestication didn't suit him one bit. He'd never been happy with one woman. He'd never wanted to settle in one place for long. He took a deep breath and forged on with his request.
If you have a cabin that's high on the mountain, one that's isolated and as far up as possible, I'd love to use that one. I do, but it's way up there, man.
Grant ran fingers through his hair.
You sure? That one doesn't have electricity yet. I've got Joe modernizing the cabins, but we were reserving some of them for late spring when getting up there and back down would be easier. I'm positive.
Kane knew he practically glowed with excitement. A cabin without electricity that wasn't easy to get to, that'd be right up his alley. A dream come true if you'd asked him. A small gasp escaped May.
Isn't that the one way up in the clearing? I don't think that's a good idea. Avalanches.
She paused. She was probably hoping he'd take the hint. Yeah, he wasn't going to take any hints.
Avalanches don't mean anything to me. I'd hibernate through one.
He shrugged. No biggie for Kane. An avalanche was the least of his problems. Unless he was trapped with unfriendly shifters and outnumbered like he'd been a few days ago. He didn't think that would happen again. He'd done a great job covering his tracks. His stomach growled loudly in hunger, reacting to the tempting aromas that were coming from the kitchen.
"Sorry,"
Kane said.
"It's been a while since I had a meal."
What the hell? Were they going to take his hint? When were they going to sit down to dinner?
"Shall we?"
He started toward the kitchen, not wanting to be rude, but at the same time, he needed some damned food. May put a hand on his shoulder.
"We were going to wait for Astra." "Why? Is there some sort of rule that says she can't examine a shifter unless he's got an empty stomach?"
Chelsea stifled a giggle. May shook her head as if he were incorrigible or hopeless, or both. Grant was the only one of the three who remained serious.
"No, we invited her to join us for dinner. It's nice to do that since Doc's out of town."
Grant's manner of speaking was easygoing, but there was a level of tension in his demeanor that threw Kane off again. Something was making his senses go on high alert.
"So, what are you not telling me then?"
Kane narrowed his eyes, his gaze penetrating. He focused on May, though he knew she wouldn't give information easily if she didn't want to. He didn't want to turn his scrutiny on to Chelsea. He wasn't sure Grant would appreciate his pushing her around, and since Grant was going to provide him with a cabin to stay in for a while, he didn't think that bullying Grant's woman for answers would be all that cool. May sighed as if she was ready to give up.
"She's got a thing for shifters, that's all."
Kane cocked his head.
"Like, she's a freak and loves to do shifters? A shifter groupie kind of thing?"
Laughter roared out of Grant.
"No, more like she hates shifters."
He managed to get the words out between bursts of laughter. Kane gave a perfunctory nod, confused at the humor of the situation. A knock on the door stopped Grant's laughter. Chapter 3. Astra shivered from the brisk weather. She and Doc had moved away after her mother died, only returning to Doc's old stomping grounds and the place where Astra's mother had died a few months ago. But in no time, Astra was eager to move away again, to a better climate. Florida, Texas, California, anywhere but up here in the mountains. She'd have left already if it weren't for Doc. Sure, her mother had told Doc to take care of Astra, but Astra took care of Doc too. He needed someone to keep up with his daily needs. How could a man make it through medical school but forget to eat breakfast and lunch on many days? And how could he forget simple stuff like paying his bills on time? Astra shook her head. She could hear Grant laughing on the other side of the door. Maybe that was why they hadn't answered her knock. They couldn't hear it. She held the pot against her body with one hand and knocked again with the other. Except this time she pounded on the door and was tempted to kick it with her hiking boots so they'd open up. On the other side of the door, the sounds of merriment died abruptly. The door swung open and Grant greeted her with a wide smile. Chelsea pushed in front of him to take the pot and at the same time give Astra a warm hug, wrapping her in her arms, her body warm from the room's heat. May cut in, giving Astra an exuberant hug too. What gives? So much excitement to see her? Had they been lying when they said Chelsea wasn't pregnant? Why else would they be acting weird like this? Astra stepped around May and Chelsea and ran into a solid wall of man-chest. It wasn't Grant. She raised her gaze slowly, her eyes rising from the broad expanse of glorious man-chest covered in a faded flannel shirt over a t-shirt. The next thing that came into view was a strong jaw, a chin that had just enough of a cleft to be sexy, but not obscenely movie starish, and a stubble that made thoughts run through her mind. Dirty thoughts. Damn, what the hell? She hadn't even looked in his eyes yet, and she was already reacting as if she were in heat. She wasn't, damn it, and she wasn't interested in meeting a man. She didn't have time for a man. She raised her gaze over sculpted cheekbones to his eyes. Holy hell! The intensity of his scrutiny seared straight through her. Then it hit her, and instinct caused her to raise her hand to hit someone, something. He's a shifter! Fury burned through Astra with a fierceness that cut her to the core. Grant knew how she felt about shifters. Averting her eyes from the gorgeous mountain-sized man in front of her, she turned a burning look toward Grant. You know how I feel about this. Astra spun toward May, tears clouding her vision. She closed her eyes to hide the tears, but the starburst explosions behind her lids didn't help. She felt dizzy. She couldn't breathe. Seeing a shifter brought back one memory, the memory of her mother fighting shifters to keep them away from Astra until Doc arrived on the scene, saving Astra's life, but too late to save her mother's life. Her mother, bloody, bleeding, soaked in crimson, her flesh shredded, holding on to life by a thread after saving her daughter from death. Breathing her last breath in Doc's arms, Astra hadn't talked for months after that. If her father had been around, if she'd had a father, or even some distant relatives, she'd have been sent to live with them. But all she had was Doc. Doc, who was a shifter, one of the kind she hated for killing her mother. Doc became her salvation, her parent, her guardian, even her best friend. Doc's friend Grant, who in turn became her friend, despite how Astra felt about shifters. Now they'd betrayed her and put yet another shifter in her life. Damn them! If she had the means, she'd end all shifters' lives. Fearful that she'd falter, even fall, Astra put a hand out to steady herself. Too late. She stumbled, and her eyes flew open. All she could see was the black-eyed gaze of the striking shifter in front of her. Breathe, she told herself. Breathe. She couldn't. Why didn't her lungs want to work? Chapter 4. Kane stared at the ashen-haired, curvaceous beauty in front of him. His bear could hear her erratic heartbeat and feel her pulse through his senses. This was the Astra they had talked about. The Astra who hates shifters. Kane had no doubt of that. Once she had realized what he was, her fury and hatred were palpable. He smelled her interest, even arousal, though it was faint and only in the early stages, until she'd figured out that he was a shifter. Then she'd done a complete 180. It was odd that she'd known it immediately, without his saying a word or doing a single thing. Like she had some sort of sense about it. Astra closed her eyes, tilted, and began to fall. Kane reached out, holding her, resting her body against his own. After that, he froze. What was he supposed to do? How could he help her when she held such vehemence toward him? The other thing that paralyzed him was the ferocity with which his bear was reacting to her. It was as if the bear knew something about her that Kane hadn't put together yet. Sure, Kane was attracted to her. What red-blooded man wouldn't be? She had all the right curves in all the right places. A set of tits made for handling, an ass that a man would love to have on display while taking her from behind. Not to mention her scent. Damn, the woman's scent was driving his bear crazy, which was making his cock strain in his pants, even in the middle of this drama. He pushed her hair off her face, tucked it back. Her eyes flew open. They were a light green in color, clearer than the clearest water he'd ever seen, and he was drawn in, unable to look elsewhere, unable to think of anything else. There was a fire behind those light green eyes that appealed to the man in him. A spirit, an intelligence, and an openness he wanted to know more about. Well, her eyes had all of that until she focused on his face and put together the fact that he was keeping her from falling. And then all hell broke loose. She pushed off of him aggressively. Shoving his chest, she stumbled backward, then righted herself, standing tall, her body ramrod straight, as if a steel rod had replaced her spine. "Don't touch me!" Her voice was full of the same steel as the rod she seemed to have in her back. "Don't ever touch me!" she hissed. Kane looked at May, then back at the ashen-haired, green-eyed Astra.
"I'm sorry."
Even to his own ears, his apology didn't sound sincere. He wasn't sorry. Hell no. He'd done nothing to merit her vitriol. If anything, he'd tried to help her. What was her deal with shifters anyway? And Grant was a shifter, so her anger made no sense. Chelsea stared at them, open-mouthed. Grant's arms were by his sides, as if he too were confounded by the display. May stepped between Astra and Kane.
"Kane, this is Astra. Astra, Kane."
May put her hand on Astra's shoulder as if she wanted to steady her or keep her from running away. May put her other hand on Kane's shoulder. Kane nodded his greeting, acknowledging the introduction. He wasn't interested in doing more. This woman hated him. Here she was in her hiking boots, jeans that flared over a pair of hips he'd like to...
"Okay, what the fuck?"
He reined the bear's libido in. It had to be the bear. It couldn't be him. No, it couldn't be. He was impervious to women. May squeezed his shoulder, her grip unforgiving. She gave a small nod, indicating Astra.
"Fine, fine."
He'd make nice.
"Kane Ortiz."
He stuck his hand out. Astra left him hanging, his hand outstretched. Casually, to keep from being noticed, Kane pulled his hand back, acting nonchalant, as if it wasn't a big deal.
"It's a pleasure to meet you, Astra."
He kept his Texas drawl under control. No easy feat when you'd spent as much time in Texas as he had in the last century. Astra glared at him, didn't say a word, just glared. Well, was May going to squeeze her shoulder too, or what? Was he the only one who was to be treated like a child? He gave May a dirty look for giving Astra a pass. Talk about a room with palpable tension. Kane refrained from shaking his head at all of it. So much drama. He'd have been better off not coming north if he'd only known he'd have to deal with temperamental women, even if they were hot. Grant cleared his throat. Chelsea emitted a nervous giggle. "Why don't we eat before everything gets cold?" Kane's stomach growled a response. It was his stomach. Though he knew, deep inside, his bear was still responding to the woman in Astra. Chapter 5. Astra tugged on Grant's sleeve. "Can I see you for a moment before we eat?" She tugged again. Grant looked at Chelsea as if to verify it was okay. Chelsea gave him a nod and said, "We'll set the table while you talk." "May, you too?" Astra added. "Kane, give me a hand." Chelsea took Kane's arm and let him escort her to the kitchen with a backward glance at Grant. When the coast was clear and she was alone with May and Grant, Astra whirled on them. "Why am I here?" She fought and failed to keep her hostility from her voice.
"Because Doc's not available?"
Grant's expression was stern, but there was an underlying note of concern there. He knew what this all meant to her. "You know I don't treat shifters." The only thing she wanted to treat shifters to was the business end of a shotgun.
"You've treated me more than once."
Grant shoved his hands in his pockets. "That's different. I care for you." Astra couldn't believe he was pulling that card.
"As a personal favor?"
Grant used his favorite uncle's voice.
"Please."
She harumphed and blew her hair out of her face. "What do you have to say about this?" Astra turned toward May. May put her hand on Astra's cheek.
"I'm sorry. If this could have been avoided, he's a nephew."
"You and your nephews." His kind killed my mother. Astra gritted her teeth, her jaw clenched to the point of giving her pain.
Astra, you could say the same thing about me,
Grant pointed out. You are different. Why didn't they get it? Your family.
Kane's different too,
May said. Oh, really? Let's see. So tell me why I'm here if he's different. I don't see anything wrong with him other than a few bruises and abrasions on his face. So why am I here? At least Grant had the dignity to look embarrassed because Astra was pretty sure why she was here. For real, why else would she be?
He was bitten,
May said. So they weren't going to come out and say it, were they? She wasn't going to play 20 questions, and she knew it wasn't a dog bite or a cat bite that had forced them to call. Bitten by a shifter, she spat it out since they wouldn't. May and Grant nodded slowly, simultaneously. May spoke first.
Please, just check. Make sure he's not infected.
Doc knows more about this stuff than I do. Astra crossed her hands over her chest and planted her boots firmly on the thick carpeting, shoulder-width apart. And you know I don't give a damn about other shifters. Liar, liar, pants on fire, a voice in her head said. Fine. She didn't want to admit it, not even to herself, but there was something about this man Kane that drew her in. It more than drew her in, but she didn't want to qualify or quantify it. She felt a crazy attraction for him deep, deep inside, an attraction she was so adamant in denying that she'd reacted vehemently and unapologetically. And she was pissed at herself. She had no business being attracted to a shifter. Look where it had gotten her mother. Dead, a bloody mess who died in front of the ones who loved her and left behind a motherless daughter. Astra drew in a deep breath. Between the hectic week's fatigue and this new shifter, she was sounding irrational. I won't have more territorial fights. I won't see the only shifters I love killed. That shifter needs to leave. Grant looked at May pointedly. What? Astra glanced between them. What? What?
He's staying in the cabin in North Point End.
What? She shut her mouth, containing the rest of her screech. You invited him to stay? She hissed.
A short stay, May appended.
Astra smacked her forehead with her palm. Did her friends and family have a death wish? She'd have to convince that damned shifter to get the hell out of the area before more trouble showed up. Fine, I'll check him. She rubbed her hands on the tops of her thighs to get rid of the sweat that was building up. Sweat, because she had other intentions for that damned shifter. He had to go. Period. Now she had to come up with a plan. All she had was the time it would take to eat dinner to come up with something. Chapter 6. Kane followed Chelsea into the kitchen. She was a cute thing, but nothing like the firebrand in the other room. That one would spit fire darts at him if she could. He bet she'd be some kind of fun in bed with that inner fire of hers. Probably some kind of fun out of bed, too, if she didn't hate him so damn much.
Where do you come from?
Chelsea asked, indicating the sink so he could wash up. Kane turned the water on, squirted some soap on his hands, lathered, and rinsed.
I've been in Texas more than any place else for the last few years.
He didn't want to say decades. Some people, even those who had bonded with shifters, were creeped out by their longevity. It wasn't all that hard to imagine someone living for centuries, or at least he didn't think it should be so hard to swallow. Hell, churchgoers and anyone else who read the Bible knew that the people in the Bible had lived for centuries. Why was it so hard to wrap their minds around shifters living for a hell of a long time? So where are you going?
You don't beat around the bush much, do you?
She sure got straight to the point.
I'm not sure yet. I'm in transition.
Transition was a good way to say,
hiding from a bunch of ruthless mercenary shifters that want to see me dead.
Kane took the casserole dish from Chelsea and walked it to the oversized picnic-style pine table.
How long have you and Grant been together?
About a month. We're making it official in a few weeks. A blush rose from her neck to her cheeks. Kind of cute if you liked blushing women. He reminded himself he liked all women, but for some reason, a woman with ash blonde hair and light green eyes and a fierceness that rivaled his bear's ferocity kept coming to his mind. What the hell is wrong with him? The bear. He blamed the damned bear. Unlike many shifters who had fairly peaceful relationships with their bears, Kane found himself occasionally mentally duking it out with his damned ursine other half.
Congratulations. I'm sure you'll be happy together.
Chelsea's smile beamed from her pretty face. She handed some flatware to set on the table, a bunch of napkins, and a trivet. Do you have someone you're happy with?
Someone I'm happy with? I've had plenty of someones I've been happy with. Not the way you and Grant are. Safe enough answer.
Kane set the table for her. A look of pity crossed Chelsea's face. You'll find someone when the time is right. You don't seem to be a complete stranger to setting a table. That's a bonus. She gave him a conspiratorial wink.
Maybe not so safe an answer, judging from her reaction.
She looked like she wanted everyone to be in the same boat she and Grant were in. Kane didn't want to correct her. He wasn't looking for someone. He let that romantic notion of hers sit. What he was looking for was simple, to stay out of sight until he wasn't hunted anymore. Self-fucking preservation. Screw love and all that happily ever after shit. He knew better.
I'm sure when the time's right, I'll find the right woman. Or dozens of right women.
The smartass in him wanted to say, except he didn't want to say that, not at all, because still imprinted firmly in his mind was that spirited hottie in the other room. Damn her, she'd gotten under his skin.
Maybe I should fuck her so I can get her out of my system.
Hell, now he was really thinking crazy. That kind of thinking would get him kicked out of the cabin. He couldn't do that shit. It wouldn't sit well with Grant. The best thing he could do would be to stay the hell away from that hottie. Chapter 7. Game on. Astra smiled her prettiest smile. At least she hoped it was her prettiest smile, since trying to be flirty wasn't something she normally did. She sucked at flirting. She was awkward at that whole charming men thing. It wasn't like she was a virgin or anything. She just didn't get all the social niceties that she was supposed to be able to handle. She took a seat where Chelsea indicated, which was next to Kane, the hunk of a shifter Astra had to get out of Bear Canyon Valley, quickly. She wanted no other shifters around. Shifters killed stranger shifters and their loved ones, and there was no way she was going to let Kane embroil Grant and Doc in a shifter territorial battle. She'd kill to prevent that, or die trying. She sat on the bench next to the large shifter man and cursed the picnic table setup that Grant's kitchen had. Why couldn't he have regular chairs and a table like the rest of the world? Astra's shoulder rubbed against the man's huge arm. She cringed and tried to draw away, but if she kept that up, she'd fall off the bench. Damn him! She really wanted to tell him to scoot over, but no, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Astra ignored that his closeness and how the touch of his body sent a current through hers, even when they were separated by several layers of fabrics, his and her clothing. Dinner would not be fun.
Pass the bread, please.
Kane's voice was soft in her ear, as if he were telling her a secret he didn't want the others to hear. Astra forced a smile to her lips, reached for the basket, and handed it to him, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Kane took it from her, his large fingers closing over hers. A tiny gasp escaped her as the surge of current that flew through her body culminated between her legs. God damn him! What was that about? He gave her a sideways glance as if he knew the effect he'd had on her. That made her hate him even more. Hate. An odd word. Yes, she hated him. No, she didn't. She couldn't say what she felt for him. She'd rather feel nothing. She wished he'd never come to Bear Canyon Valley. That's how dinner went. Astra couldn't concentrate on the food, couldn't even remember what she'd put on her plate and what she hadn't. Another reason not to like him. He interfered with the enjoyment of her meal. "Kelsey's throwing me a bridal shower," Chelsea said. "It's on the 8th. Can you make it?" she asked Astra. "Like I have a social life that would keep me from going?" Of course she'd make it. "I'd love to come." Astra smiled, pretending to pay attention to the others, pretending to ignore the way the man next to her was affecting her. She didn't have much to say during the meal, though, and neither did the gorgeous stranger next to her. May and Chelsea held up the conversation, while Grant contributed something every so often. Mostly, they talked about preparations for the wedding. May was talking about the bed and breakfast being a perfect place for Chelsea and Grant's wedding. Grant said it was up to Chelsea. Astra wasn't bored with the conversation. She just couldn't focus on it. She normally would have paid attention, or tried to at least, but all she could do now was concentrate on controlling her pulse and her breathing. She knew shifters had extraordinary senses and was worried he'd be aware of her accelerated heart rate and shallow breathing. She hoped that he wasn't, but she wasn't sure. Every time Doc had tried to talk about his shifter senses and his life as a shifter, she'd shut the conversation down because she had no interest in that part of him, the part she hated.
"When is Doc coming back?"
Grant asked. "Probably late tomorrow or the day after," Astra answered. Kane shifted, his thigh rubbing against hers, pressing on her leg. She probably couldn't fit a butter knife between them. That's how close he was to her. She moved slightly, but her ass was already partially off the bench. Any further movement, and she'd land embarrassingly on the same ass that was trying to avoid being near him. He'd love that. He'd probably laugh at her. She gave him a dirty look. The only thing was, he was already looking at her. His dark, near-black eyes were hooded in a lazy bedroom eyes kind of way. He raised the fork to his mouth, a piece of meat impaled on the tines. He put the fork between his lips and his teeth closed over it, pulling the meat off the fork in a way that was far too sexual for Astra's comfort. She looked away immediately, glancing at May. May was watching Astra as if she'd been reading her emotions and thoughts. Astra looked at her napkin. She'd had enough. She folded the rectangle of linen neatly and tucked it under the rim of her plate. "I'm done." God, was she ever? Stick a damned fork in her. She was done. Done, done, done. And practically panting over this man. Like there weren't other men in Bear Canyon Valley. She fought the urge to roll her eyes at herself, mostly because she knew many of the men in the valley, and none of them had this effect on her. That made this whole situation doubly irritating. Why did she have to be attracted to the one man she wanted to hate and drive out of town? As if they'd been waiting for Astra, now everyone else was saying how full they were, and they were pushing back from the table, rising to their feet. Kane rose and held out a hand to help her to a stand. "Really? Like we're friends now or something?" She bit back a response and tried to graciously accept his hand, using his grip to stand quickly, then releasing it as if it were on fire. Which, yeah, it was burning her, but not in that way. She'd almost come up with a plan to get him out of the valley. She just had a few more final touches to put into thought. Then she could go through the motions and put her plan into play. Chapter 8. Astra was up to something. Of that Kane was sure. He helped her stand, then he looked at Grant. If he had his own place, Kane would have already left, but he was at Grant's mercy. He needed to know where this cabin was and how to get there. Before he could do that, he had to be examined by the hot blonde with an awesome rack and a killer ass who was standing next to him. Making it all worse, her curvy hotness had a cryptic smile on her face and was not making eye contact with him.
"Yep, she's definitely up to something."
He'd put money down that whatever she was up to would not bode well for him.
"We can use the library,"
Grant showed the direction with a nod. It was a long hall, dimly lit, painted a dark green color. Grant led the way. Kane indicated for Astra to follow Grant. She rewarded him with a dirty look, then quickly made it vanish and replaced it with a stoic expression. Kane's reasons for following her were twofold. Sure, he didn't mind the opportunity to keep a close eye on her, since now he was starting to question her motives, but the other half of him, that half of him wanted to watch her ass as her hips swayed. An ass like that needed to be appreciated. She was definitely the kind of woman that a man wanted to watch coming and going, and coming. Shit. There he went again. He licked his lower lip in anticipation of having her check him out. Medically, of course. And maybe not medically as well. Chelsea and May stayed in the kitchen, though Kane knew May well enough to know that she wanted to come along. Grant's home was like a mansion, but rustic. Actually, it was like an old-world fortress with a new-world look, if Kane had to describe it. A few dozen feet down, several closed doors later, the three of them were in the entryway, beside the giant double doors they'd come in through when he'd first gotten to town. They made a sharp left past another set of double doors, this time made of glass, and they arrived at a huge library with a roaring fireplace. A dark wood desk dominated the room, rivaled only by the large fireplace tucked into one wall. Grant closed the doors behind them, giving them total privacy. "So what's the deal?" Astra jumped right into the subject. Grant chewed on his lip, worry crossing his face.
"We need you to check Kane out."
"What am I checking him for?" Her demeanor was cool and detached.
"I was attacked by shifters,"
Kane started. Grant went into a coughing spell, interrupting Kane's statement. Kane narrowed his eyes at Grant, a question in his expression that he hoped the other man would read. Kane had no idea what to say. It seemed like he set Astra off way too easily. Astra spun around, pointed a finger at Grant, and then pushed the finger into his chest. "You know damned well how I feel about this."
"Look,"
Kane started.
"I don't have to. It's fine." "No, it's not fine."
Grant gave Astra a stern look.
"Listen, if he's infected by a touched shifter, then he's got to be helped. We need to know that the bite isn't from a touched one, period. He cannot die. It will break May's heart. She cares for Kane."
"Why don't you tell me how this whole thing works first?" Astra sat on the edge of the desk.
"You mean you don't know?"
Grant's tone was incredulous.
"How can you not know when Doc... Hasn't Doc told you?"
"He tried." A sheepish grin crossed Astra's face. "I didn't want to know."
"If you didn't know, then you couldn't help him if he needed help."
"Fine, Grant," she spat. "I'm a shitty daughter, a sucky person. I get it, okay? I suck." Grant put his arms around her. She sniffled once, then pulled away. The whites of her eyes were red, which made the green that much more vivid.
"Do you know how to kill a shifter?"
Grant asked Astra. Kane thought it best he be silent. He didn't want to say the wrong thing or say the right thing at the wrong time and piss her off again. "I'm not that insensitive. I did hear him when he told me that." Astra pouted. Her full lips looked perfectly kissable to Kane. He turned his gaze away. The last thing he needed to do was pitch a tent right now. Astra continued. "You separate a shifter from his bear." Grant nodded.
"But do you know how to do that? How that happens?"
Astra shook her head, then hung it low.
"Couple of ways. Don't feel bad. I had to explain them to Chelsea in case." "One way."
Grant took a deep breath.
"One way to separate a shifter from their bear is to decapitate the shifter. That ends it."
He clapped his hands together as if dusting them off.
"The other way is to be bitten by a touched shifter. When a touched one bites a shifter, a battle begins within the shifter to kill the shifter's bear. By the way, it doesn't just apply to bears. All shifters are the same."
"So the kit Doc told me to carry, the one that tests to see if a shifter was bitten by a touched?"
"Do you have a kit?"
Grant's face lit up, hopeful. He said I have to carry it in my bag all the time because he never knew if he would need it.
Yes,
Grant exclaimed. What happens if it tests positive? Then what? Grant frowned.
that's a different problem altogether. It's better not to take chances and find out.
What if a touched one bites a human? Astra asked. Kane found himself admiring her intelligence and curiosity. There was something special about this woman. The way she thought, the reactions she had. She wouldn't be boring to have around.
Don't worry. If a touched one wants to hurt a human, it's unlikely the human will escape with just a bite. Humans don't stand a chance against shifters. Any shifter, touched or not, will kill a human if it wants to.
I'll get the test. Astra opened a black bag and removed what looked like a miniature shaving kit. From it, she set out a slide, a cotton-tip swab, and a medicine dropper in a black-colored glass container. As she sorted the equipment, Kane wasn't sure what he had to do, or what she had to do, or where, but figured it would have something to do with his wounds. Kane removed his flannel shirt and pulled the tea over his head. Okay, now, Astra turned around and froze. The bottle that was in her hand started to slip out. She fumbled with it. Grant and Kane both dove for it. Kane snatched it midair. Chapter 9. Astra thought she was going to have a heart attack. She dropped the glass bottle. What the hell? Who could blame her? She peeked at the man who'd caught it midair. Kane. He was shirtless. With dark olive skin, his chest was as broad as a door, sprinkled with hair, all man, all sexy. His pecs looked like they were made of steel, above a set of abs that she wanted to run her tongue over. A treasure trail of hair led from his navel, all the way down to the treasure. She wanted to shake the image out of her head. Jeez. He'd stunned her so much that she'd dropped the stupid bottle. Why the hell was it glass? Too fragile, she swore under her breath. Both Grant and Kane looked at her. She knew their bears had hurt her, even if a normal human couldn't have. Sorry, she mumbled, reaching for the bottle, averting her eyes from Kane's body. My hands were moist, probably sweat. She tried to talk her way out of how she'd come to drop the bottle, as if the reason wasn't his muscles, that chest, those abs and arms. No, it couldn't be that at all. A tiny snigger made her look at Kane. Amusement glinted in his eyes, as though he knew he'd affected her. She snatched the bottle from his grip, ignoring the charge that she felt in her fingertips when her hand touched his. That's when she saw. She gasped. A brief glance, and she'd made a quick assessment. She couldn't keep herself from continuing to look. His upper chest and shoulders were covered with bite marks and claw marks, deep ones. He'd really been attacked, seriously. What the hell? She muttered. What happened to you?
3 very nasty rovers,
Kane said. Astra looked at Grant for an explanation, and at the same time cursed herself for never allowing Doc to tell her about his life and to define all the terms that applied to it. What are rovers?
Rovers,
Grant said.
Shifters who are for hire, roving, doing deeds they're paid to do.
Like mercenaries? Astra frowned, then turned to Kane. What did you do to deserve having rovers sicked on you? Chapter 10. Kane grimaced, not really wanting to get into it with her. She was too volatile, and too much hinged on his being able to keep the peace around here, at least long enough to get to a cabin to put some space between him and the rest of the world. Which reminded him. Kane turned to Grant.
I ran out of hunter's block. Any chance you know where I can get hold of some? I can pay for it. I've got some you can have,
Grant offered. Relief coursed through Kane. At least that part was covered.
So, back to the test?
Hold out your hand. Astra's voice was professional, strictly business. He did so. She took it, separated his index finger, and using a diabetic type of gun implement, she pricked it. She caught the drop of blood with a tiny glass tube, let the drop fall to a glass slide on the desk, then squirted one drop of whatever was in the black bottle onto his blood.
What does it do?
It's supposed to bubble, like when hydrogen peroxide is applied to blood. Astra shrugged. If it bubbles, that's bad. No reaction. Kane let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For him, the whole touched thing was abstract, as if it couldn't possibly happen to him until Grant had started talking about it. Then Kane had realized how screwed he'd be if he were infected. He didn't know the first thing about becoming uninfected, unless Grant knew, or knew someone who did. He blew out a sigh, his chest deflating. He'd gotten lucky.
What if...
He unclenched the fist he'd made while Grant explained the whole touch thing. Looks like you're in the clear, Astra announced. She packed the testing kit in the little black bag, then threw his clothing at him.
No physical?
Kane couldn't help the teasing note his tone took on. Maybe relief did that, or maybe adrenaline from having been worried and then coming down from that worry. Astra tossed him a frosty, dirty look. No. Her reply was quick and curt. She turned to Grant, waved her hand at Kane. Now what? It was clear she was talking about Kane, yet she was acting like he wasn't even there.
I guess that's all, Astra.
Grant smiled, clearly trying to lighten up the mood. No, really, Astra persisted. What about him, now?
He's staying in the cabin at North Point End,
Grant answered. Kane felt like leaving them alone to have their talk. In fact, that was exactly what he needed to do.
I'll go see if May and Chelsea need any help.
He took a stride toward the glass double doors. No! Astra's voice was sharp, loud. Stay! He kept his hand on the door handle, but didn't turn it, nor did he turn to face her. Please. Her voice softened. He took his hand off the knob, then turned around and looked at her. He'd never seen this softer side of her. I'll give you a ride to the cabin. She turned to Grant. I'll take him to North Point End.
I don't think so,
Grant said before Kane could even think of thanking her for the offer. Why not?
There's a snowstorm coming. You don't need to be out there, a woman alone.
Then who's going to go? She planted her fists on her hips. Not May, and if you go, then Chelsea will be worried all night. Grant squinted at her. Kane cocked his head. She made sense when she put it that way, but when he thought of her taking him somewhere, who knew how far away, but it was up a mountain, then driving back alone, that didn't sit well with Kane.
I'll go with you,
Grant said. You're being silly. My place is closer to it than yours. Kane felt like he was watching a ping-pong match, trying to keep up with the argument these two were having.
I'll look after her,
Kane said, though he could see the flaw in his logic. It was very flawed, because who was going to look after her after she dropped him off, unless he could talk her into staying until morning? The bear made a growling sound of approval in his head.
Yeah, I bet you do like that.
Grant shook his head as if he was uncertain.
Let me talk to May and Chelsea.
He stepped toward the doorway. Grant? There was a measure of steeliness in Astra's tone. Grant froze. I know it's hard for you to accept that I'm an adult. I get that you want to take care of me like Doc would, but I'm not a child. I don't need your permission to give someone a ride.
Oh, shit. Now she's gone and put me in the middle of it.
Kane took a step back. It was either piss Grant off or piss the hottie off. Easy solution here. He'd sooner piss Grant off.
I'll make sure she's fine.
You don't have a choice, really, Astra told Grant, buttressing her argument. If I have a problem, I'll know you'll shift and come save me.
Okay, surely Grant could see the logic in that.
Grant exhaled a long, drawn-out sigh.
So be it. Call me to let me know you're okay.
Chapter 11. Astra gave Kane a dirty look, ignoring his attempt to help her with her coat. She shrugged it on by herself. Grant put his arm around Astra.
"Call us when you get home."
She rolled her eyes and bit back a smart-ass sarcastic remark. She and Kane got in her Jeep. She started it and headed down the road toward North Point. The vehicle seemed small with a mountain-sized man in it. She tried not to let his size affect her. Size and sexiness. She had her plan ready. It was simple. Talk him into leaving the valley immediately before the ones who were hunting him could find him here. If that failed, she had her pistol in the back. She gave him a sideways glance. He was staring straight ahead, his profile aquiline, his skin tone beautifully dusky in the dimness of the dashboard's lighting. Full lips at rest, not smiling or talking, just looking perfectly kissable. Damn, what is wrong with me? Kissable? WTF? Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. She turned her eyes back to the road, reluctantly so. No, I can't shoot him. She'd have to talk him into leaving, somehow. What's the story with you and the ones hunting you? She could at least break the ice, make nice, and then make her request.
"It's a long story. Is this going to be a long drive?"
She thought for a moment. She could make it as long as she needed to by going back and forth on back roads to get the story. Not the safest option, perhaps. No, not that long. He realigned himself in the seat, moving so that he was facing her more than before.
"Why are you asking?"
I guess if we have bad guys. Wow, did I really just sound so cliché? If there are rovers following you, then it would be nice to know why, in case we have a problem with them.
"You shouldn't. I used block to disguise my scent, and I was very careful."
Famous last words, she muttered. Outside, the snow began to fall more heavily. She ignored it. She couldn't let a little snow stop her from her mission. He rubbed his jaw, the scruff of his few days' growth of beard making a scratchy sound.
"You really want to know?"
She didn't trust the tone in his voice. You really think you can throw them off your trail? He was silent for so long she began to think he either hadn't heard her or he was ignoring her question.
"Think so?"
His words were almost a whisper. A shiver ran through her. Can I make a request of you?
"Shoot."
I may not have a right to make a request, though I did run that test on you. She let the word sit for a moment for emphasis. He owed her. I don't want to lose any more of my family members to shifters. If you keep moving and you're not here, then they won't be in danger.
"So you're saying you don't want me to stay in North Point End?"
Under normal circumstances, she'd have enjoyed getting to know more about the hunky stranger. What the hell am I thinking? He's a damned shifter. There was something about him, something that clicked with her, an instant chemistry kind of thing, like a chemical reaction. Or anywhere in the valley, she added. It's too risky.
"You'd want me wandering around in this snowstorm?"
Does he have to put it that way? He made her sound horrible. Well, no. I mean, what the hell could she say now?
"Can I at least stay until morning? Just let me hole up in the cabin until the snow stops falling? Is that too much to ask?"
That didn't seem like an unreasonable request. Okay, but promise me, first opportunity, you're out of there. Chapter 12. Was she fucking kidding? Like he'd just head out?
"Just say yes."
A part of him said.
"Just tell her what she wants to hear, then get her on the road."
But he didn't want her on the road. He wanted to spend time with her, in the cabin. A lot of time. He wanted to get to know her better.
"She hates you, idiot,"
that same part of him said.
"So walk away, let her go, and then stay in the cabin until you're ready to move on."
He couldn't let her go. There was something about that woman. She'd said first opportunity, which left it to his discretion. He would choose to define first opportunity as he pleased.
First opportunity, I will.
He used his most sincere voice.
But there's a condition.
Her head snapped his way. She glared at him.
Pay attention to the road. Pay attention to the road.
He put a finger at the crook of her jaw, right under her ear, then drew it forward until it was on the side of her chin. Applying gentle pressure, he guided her head toward facing the road. He clenched his teeth at the temptation of having his hand on her. His bear felt her heart rate increase and was reacting to it. Moving his hand a bit, he put his thumb on her lower lip, tracing it, relishing its softness. Her breathing became shallower. Her eyelids lowered a fraction in response. The scent of her arousal filled his senses. His bear felt it when her resistance was beginning to kick in, and a second later, she moved her head to the left abruptly. "What's your condition?" His condition right now was a state of arousal that culminated in a raging hard-on that bordered on painful. His condition was crazy sexy and turned on by this woman. He wanted to claim her, make her his. He wanted her to submit to him and give all of herself to him without holding anything back. He cleared his throat to get the arousal lump that seemed to have blocked his voice to go away.
My condition?
More throat clearing because he sounded like a frog in season.
My condition is that you spend some time with me in the cabin. I'll be good, I promise.
He'd be damned good if she'd give his tongue, hands, and cock a chance. He shook the bear off.
Damn, easy already.
Why do you want me to spend time with you in the cabin? Chapter 13. Astra had no intention of admitting this to the gorgeous hunk of bear shifter next to her, but the idea of spending some time with him didn't sound bad at all. She was starved for human, even semi-human, companionship. As far as men went, well, shit, it had been a year since she'd had sex. She bit back the sigh that threatened to come out at the thought of having sex. Good sex. The last time she'd had sex, she couldn't call that good sex. She didn't want to think about sex, not when she was thinking of ways to get rid of the man. Not rid, as in dead, just rid, as in gone from the valley. What's the harm in a little fun for one night before he leaves the valley? The devil on her shoulder asked. But she'd never been one to give in to the little she-devil that perched on her left. Okay, take that back. She hadn't done it often. There were a couple of times, though. What if he's a serial killer? The level-headed one on her right shoulder asked. As if May would have a nephew like that. Plus, there was something about his eyes. Deep in that darkness, Astra saw honesty and goodness. Sure, okay. She also recognized that as a shifter, he could be, a dangerous man, but not toward her. Of that she felt certain. Famous last words came from her right shoulder just before Astra could shut that voice down for the rest of the night. Of course, the other shoulder had to chime in. But sexy as hell. Astra shut that one down, too. She didn't need anything influencing her more than this man's sex appeal did. So basically, she thought, sure, why not go inside? She did want to know more about the guy and what had brought him here, and to find out if there were other shifters following him. But she wouldn't lie to herself. She really wanted to know him and to find out more about shifters. She was ashamed of herself for having shut Doc down every time he tried to talk to her about shifters. She owed it to him to learn more about his people. No, his kind, not people. Doc was the closest thing she had to a dad. Hell, he was her dad.
Earth to Astra?
She turned toward Kane. Sorry.
You asked me a question, then you zoned out, so maybe the answer doesn't matter? Or maybe you can just say yes and not ask questions?
No, I want to know. Why do you want me to spend time with you?
Aside from the fact that you're a gorgeous woman with brains?
Astra gave him a look. Laying it on thick, isn't he? Yeah, aside from that. But deep down, she couldn't deny that the comet had gotten to her. She felt a warmth that wasn't related to her vehicle's heater flood through her body. A warmth that made all the right parts tingle.
That was rhetorical.
The smile he flashed her probably had women dropping panties anywhere he went.
So, you coming in, or what?
Chapter 14. All in. Astra was all in and definitely going into the cabin. For all the right reasons and some of the wrong ones, very wrong ones. Damned if those wrong reasons didn't feel very right, though. There was something about this guy. That feeling hadn't changed. She took the right turn that led to the driveway for the cabin, if you wanted to call a wide path a driveway. She hit the brakes. Damn, that was close. A huge fallen tree blocked the Jeep's forward progress. She put it in park. Shit.
Want me to try and move it?
Kane offered. No. Astra looked at the man's chest and arms. A huge part of her believed Kane could move the tree. The other part of her said no. She looked out her driver's window. The road was on a curve, the mountainside dropping steeply only 4 feet away from her door.
How far are we from the cabin?
A few dozen yards walk, not much. But there was more distance than she relished walking in this cold. Still, she didn't want him to hurt himself trying to move the Jeep. Kane looked out the windshield, then turned that smoldering gaze back on her.
Is a little walk going to keep us from our objectives?
Well said. The man was oozing sexuality. She squeezed her legs together subtly to make the buzzing he created between them go away. She hoped he wouldn't notice. She wasn't going to let the fallen tree and a walk keep her from her objective to get him to leave before anything bad could happen. She wasn't sure what his objectives were, though from his actions and looks she suspected one of them was getting into her panties. And is that so bad? No, it wasn't bad, and she had a fierce underlying desire to get to know him better, in all the wrong ways, even if a part of her told her that it was pointless to get to know a man better right before he was supposed to leave town.
We going or not?
Kane drummed thick fingers on muscular thighs. Astra glanced away, but not before he caught her checking him out. Yes, we're going. She turned the ignition off, pulled her gloves on, grabbed her bag, clutched the door handle, and jerked the door open. The wind slammed into her, blowing snow into the Jeep and her face. She climbed out, steadying herself on the unpacked snow, and closed her door. Uncannily fast, Kane was next to her, put his arm around her, and they started a quick walk, almost a jog, heads down, avoiding the fallen tree and staying on the driveway's snow-covered path. A few moments, and too many wind gusts later, they stepped onto the cabin's wooden porch. Kane pushed on the door. It didn't open. He looked at her.
He didn't give me a key.
Astra reached up to the porch light, pulled the fixture off the wall, and took the key out from its hiding place. Of course she knew where Grant kept keys to his cabins. Voila! She held it up for Kane to see. Her voice was loud over the wailing wind. She hadn't thought the storm would be this bad. He took the key from her, jammed it into the lock, and pushed the door open. Putting a hand on her back, he hustled her into the cold cabin. At least it wasn't windy in here, and there was a lot of firewood on the porch. It was dark in the cabin, so Astra opened the shutters of one window while Kane closed the door. The light came in, fading as the sun set and the moon rose, allowing just enough light for her to see inside the cabin. She wondered if Kane's enhanced shifter vision would have needed that bit of light. Probably not. There's a lamp on the table. Light it, and I'll close this shutter." He grabbed the hurricane lamp, took off the glass top, fed the wick, and lit it with the matches on the table. As soon as he'd covered it, Astra closed the shutters. He adjusted the flame, then reached for the other lamp on the kitchen counter.
"I told him electricity didn't matter to me."
Kane turned toward her after lighting the second one.
"At that moment, I didn't think I'd have company."
He shrugged, a half-sheepish smile on his face. "That's fine." She shivered, her voice trembling from the cold. "But how about you get the fire started?" Astra crossed her arms over her chest and sat on the sofa. Kane grabbed the throw blanket on the back of the sofa, wrapped it around her, and then did exactly as she'd asked. He started a small fire, then went outside to get more firewood. 6 trips later. The man must believe in being prepared. He closed the door and set the wood bar across its hooks to keep it barred shut. After taking his coat off, he rearranged the wood. Astra stared at the muscles that were barely concealed by the tight, worn-out fabric. His thick forearms corded with the exertion, his fingers wrapped around the wood, making Astra think of how he'd handle her body. "Down, girl, down." Chapter 15. Kane glanced toward Astra as he piled firewood in one corner of the cabin. He tried not to keep looking at her, but he couldn't help himself. Or rather, he couldn't control his bear. This was becoming ridiculous. Sure, Kane wanted to know Astra better, lots better, but his bear kept on growling and insisting that she was their mate. He wanted to have a serious talk with it, but didn't want her thinking that he'd lost his mind. Kane couldn't have asked for a luckier break than having that fallen tree block their path. It was as if the tree had wanted his plan to work. Plan? Yeah, hard to call what he had a plan. More like winging it. He had some thinking to do, some private thinking.
"I'll be right back."
He reached for the bar he'd just put in place. "Where are you going? Without a coat?"
"I won't be long, and it's not like I can't handle a little bit of cold for a few seconds."
He strode outside, closing the door as he left Astra in the safety and warmth of the cabin. The wind howled, pulling at his shirt, sending his hair in all directions. Snowflakes clung to his face, melting on impact, allowing the cold to penetrate his flesh. Kane stepped into a thicket of trees, shifting as he walked deeper. The bear's fur would prevent the cold from seeping in too quickly. He used his bear's senses to search for any scents that didn't belong, but came up with nothing.
"That's enough. Quit this. She hates shifters. She can barely stand me. You're going to get us in trouble with her. She doesn't want us."
The bear growled, ignoring his objections.
"I don't care if you think she's the one. I'm sure you're right, but what if it's not the right time?"
Another growl, matching the wind's ferocity.
"I don't know when the right time will be. Maybe the right time is in a few years."
The bear's response was quiet, barely audible.
Yes, I agree she's the right one. All right already."
A snort and a snarl ensued, filling Kane's mind, drowning out his thoughts and objectives.
"Fine, I'll leave it up to her."
He shifted back to his human form and ran for the cabin, then let himself in quickly. "What did you do?" Astra was no longer on the sofa. She'd shed the blanket and her coat and was standing by the fire, hands stretched out, jeans cupping her body from her waist to her flaring hips and nice full ass. What a sight to have greeting him when he walked into a room. Kane's thickness sprang to attention, eager for her. He stood by the door, staring at her while she looked at him over her shoulder, her full lips pursed in a rosebud of concern, brow arched, questioning his logic, maybe even his common sense. And then she turned around.
Holy Mother of Mothers.
Her nipples were pressing out, demanding his attention. One swift motion and he was next to her, breathing her in, catching her breaths with his own, sucking her essence deep into his soul, imprinting on her.
"Why are you here?"
He whispered it low, the words torn from his core. The sensation of having her so close when he wanted her so badly was overwhelming. Her light green eyes flamed a dark green hue. He could feel her pulse speeding up in his nerve endings, while at the same time her breaths were shallow with anticipation.
Do you deny wanting me?"
His lips were so close to hers that he could almost imagine the texture of their softness.
No. Yes. Why are you doing this?
Her nostrils flared in a way he recognized as flagging her desire. She put her hands up, her palms on his chest.
"I'm not doing anything."
He looked down at her hands, tiny against his torso.
"Do you want me to step away?"
The tiniest shake of her head told him everything he needed to know. He lowered his head, and his lips claimed hers. His tongue tasted her mouth, dancing with her tongue in a battle eternal. Her hands rose, caressing his chest, circling his neck, holding on as if she were drowning, giving just the slightest hint of her soul's need for him. He lifted his head just enough to look in her eyes. She raised her lids, her lime-colored eyes mirroring her regret that the kiss had halted.
"We have a connection. It feels like it's old, like it's been in place forever."
His hands cupped her cheeks, his thumbs caressing her cheekbones.
"Tell me you feel it."
She drew in a deep breath, her chest expanding, pressing against his. Her nipples pushing into his flesh, emotions flashed over her face.
"It's confusing, but I feel something,"
she said, then looked away.
"I want you."
There, he'd put it out there. It was up to her to shoot him down. Chapter 16. Astra looked into Kane's obsidian eyes. Their depths were seductive and pulling her in like a whirlpool. More like a tornado, sucking her in completely. A surge of emotion flowed throughout her being, a confusing, tumultuous upwelling of feelings that she couldn't identify, but at the same time couldn't deny. She turned from him, staring at the flickering flames, leaning against his chest, taking solace from his solid heartbeat against her back. Leaning closer to him, she denied the steel shaft of his hardness pressing into her back. She could pretend to ignore that, but she couldn't ignore the response to it that pooled between her legs. She didn't know if what she was feeling was adrenaline settling in from almost running into the fallen tree, or if it was the emotions she felt for the man. How could she feel anything for him? She barely knew him. This wasn't how it worked. And she'd heard that shifters had special chemistry between them, but she wasn't a shifter, damn it. This shit didn't happen to her. No, it was too confusing. She should get out of here right now. But even if she could, she didn't want to. And her motive for staying wasn't about making him leave. Not totally, because half of her wanted to go with him, to know more about him, to figure out this bond that she felt drawing her to him. She should ask Doc. Doc, oh shit. Doc would be worried about her. Grant probably already was, and May too. She jerked away from Kane and turned to face him.
"Oh no."
"That's not a response that does a man's ego much good."
His eyebrow quirked in mock concern, belying the glint of amusement in his eyes.
"No, it's not that. It's Grant and May. They must be worried sick about me."
She rushed to the sofa and opened her purse, nearly dumping the contents. She found the phone and pressed on Grant's name.
"Hey, I'm at the cabin." "Yeah, I'll keep you posted. Tell May, okay?"
With a quick goodbye, she hung up.
"So where were we?"
Kane was next to her, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. She cleared her throat, trying to dispel the effect he had on her.
"Yeah, like that'll work."
And not surprisingly, it didn't. She bit on her lower lip, worrying it, catching it between her teeth and releasing it.
Quit that.
He touched a finger to her lip, tracing it with his fingertip.
That's my job.
His head swooped down, almost touching her lips.
You're mine tonight.
His breath was hot on her cheek, causing a shudder to flow through her body. Astra opened her mouth to protest. He put a finger across her lips.
You said you couldn't deny it.
You have to leave, she whispered in a tormented hiss. She didn't want to imagine never seeing this man again.
I will.
His voice was steely, resolute. A sadness coursed throughout her, deeper than a second ago. He planned to go, and a part of her had wanted him to say that he wouldn't leave, couldn't leave her. Foolishness, she chastised herself. Foolishness to think that way.
You will be mine, though. I won't be without you.
A one-night stand. That's what he was proposing, like she was just a garage that would house his cock for a brief spell. Anger surged through Astra, replacing sadness with a fury that burned deep, scorching her feelings. She shoved on his chest. He didn't move. I'm not disposable. I can't be cast out. She shoved again, harder. The man didn't budge. He took her by the shoulders and pulled her close, his eyes piercing hers with their blackness.
Who said you would be cast out?
His voice resonated within her, a soft growl behind it that rumbled in the pit of her stomach and in places south. He leaned close, his lips taking hers, bruising them and claiming them. His fingers cupped her cheek, then moved lower to her jawline. His tongue parted her lips, pressing resistance away, owning hers, twining with it, not broking resistance that she wasn't even in a position to offer. His lips seared hers the same way his soul reached out to hers, the kiss delivering a message that her ears would never perceive. Her chest hurt, burning with a need to breathe, reminding her that she was holding her breath. Her hands rose, tangling in his hair, pulling his head lower, dying to be lost in him, yearning to feel alive in a way she never had before. Years of not living, years of not accepting life came pouring out into that one kiss. Chapter 17. Kane took everything that kiss had to offer him, relishing her surrender, reveling in her strength, loving her submission, completely encompassed by her need to live, as if she'd never lived. His eyes were open, studying the passion that washed over her features, imagining what it would be like when he entered her body, pushing his cock deep into her, watching her eyes widen with that penetration of her pussy and her soul, branding her as his. A roar deep in his brain reminded him that imagining it would be nothing like feeling it, and that he should be feeling it. He didn't want to scare this woman with his intensity. She'd been through so much in her life, that was clear in her soul, and it shone in her eyes when she forgot to guard against it. The bear in him pulled at him to give them both what they wanted so much, what they needed, craved, yearned for. He wanted to be so deep in her wet channel that she'd pulse against his cock when she came. Each orgasm would create a contraction that coerced and coaxed him to a climax of his own. He groaned against her mouth.
Tell me that I can have you. Tell me that you want me. I have to know you want me. I won't take anything from you that you don't give me willingly, wholeheartedly.
Yes. Her hissed reply pulled at him. His cock strained in its confines. His bear rushed forward. Chapter 18. Astra's hissed yes came from deep within. It wasn't that she didn't want to give him the yes, so much as that she couldn't imagine ever not being connected to him. How the hell that had happened was beyond her. She wanted to have answers, but was afraid that she couldn't even ask anyone. How could she explain this to Doc? He was like her father. He'd seen her as a little girl. He'd never accept this rash, rapidly reacting woman who was falling for Kane with the speed of a force of nature. Astra wasn't ready for Kane to take her into his arms, to pull her close to his hard body.
What's happening to me?
Your soul is reacting to mine.
Kane's lips moved against her neck. He picked her up and carried her to the sturdy, thick-legged table, where he shoved everything aside and set her down.
If all you want from me is tonight, then that's all I'll give you, but I want more.
His words were almost a snarl.
Much, much more.
He lowered his head and groaned into their melded lips.
Kane.
His name slid off her lips with ease, with the same sense of belonging that her own name did. His teeth nipped at her jawline, traveling downward, and his tongue trailed hotness down her neck to the neckline of her blouse.
I don't want to rush you,
he snarled as his fingers played with the top button. Her breath escaped her quickly with each movement of his fingers, each motion they made, teasing and torturing her because he wouldn't unbutton it. Frustrated, Astra reached for the button and released it from the fabric, letting him know he wasn't pushing her into anything she wasn't willing to do. She was more than willing. She craved him. It was an exaggerated yearning for Kane that she didn't understand and couldn't imagine not succumbing to. His lips landed on hers in a kiss that had an edge to it, as if he wanted to know she was for real, that she didn't intend to back down or vanish. And then, just as quickly, his fingers moved through her buttons, releasing them and parting the fabric of her top. He leaned back, studying the creamy tops of her breasts, ivory swells rising above her balconette bra, one of her few indulgences.
Beautiful.
His fingertips traced the bra's line, drifting off the hot pink fabric to flirt with her skin, teasing her in the most delicious of ways that culminated in a buzzing that ran the length of her body. His fingertips tiptoed their way down the middle of her bra, over her abdomen. She resisted the urge to suck her tummy in. If he wanted her as she was, pooch and all.
I need you,
he rumbled, touching the button on her pants, flicking it open. The sound of the zipper going down was lost in the crackling of the fire and the panting coming from her lips.
I want you.
Had those words just come out of her mouth? They had. And she admitted to herself that she did want him. She wanted everything he was, from his strength to his easy smile, to the intensity behind his black eyes, to his eagerness to be with her, to the eternal promises his eyes made. She couldn't stop her hands from drifting to his shoulders, feeling the muscles flexing beneath her fingers. They crept up the back of his thick, strong neck and were lost in his hair. She combed through his hair, her hands rising to the top of his head, wanting to pull him up to a kiss, but at the same time yearning for what she hoped he was going to do. His tongue followed the path his fingers had forged, leaving a hot, wet trail from the top of her bra to the center of her stomach, drifting down to her panties, which provided a barrier waiting for him to breach it. His slick, wet tongue ran the course of her panties, pulling her pants lower, tracing the panty line from hip to hip.
Up,
he groaned, pushing at her curvy hips and well-rounded thighs. Astra pushed her ass off the table, using her hips and legs. He pulled the pants off, then set her back down as he spread her legs. His breath was hot, warming her stomach, a harbinger of the heat he would deliver between her legs, causing her moisture to drop, waiting at the entrance for him to spread her legs so it could flow. Her groan pushed him further. He continued to travel downward, every breath warming her body. He pushed her panties aside, licking his way lower as his tongue pushed her panties downward. Her clit throbbed. He nipped at the tender skin. She closed her eyes, expecting him to lick her slowly. Astra jumped when his entire face dove into her with a ferocity that revealed his hunger for her. Her body ached with desire for him. Her breath rushed in and out of her chest, lungs burning with a need for oxygen. His lips sucked in her folds, completely taking them into his mouth, then releasing them with a popping sound that fueled her desire. He devoured her nether lips repeatedly, mercilessly, until finally he thrust his tongue into her, going in, then out, fucking her with his tongue. Her hands grabbed the edge of the table, gripping tightly. She bit down on her lip to keep from begging. The moan that came out of her made his tongue move faster. "Please," she whispered, her yearning evident. Electric charges fired in her blood. Her toes curled. Would he give her release? She couldn't wait anymore. "Kane."
"What?"
His voice was more of a growl. "I need you." She forgot all about her grip on the counter. Her restless fingers traveled to his hair, pushing his face closer to her desire, taking his tongue deeper. She flinched in surprise and pleasure when he slipped a finger in and moved his mouth to her clit and began sucking while his finger fucked her. A low moan began and rose to a crescendo, quickly becoming a scream as her muscles flexed and contracted. With a brutality she hadn't expected, she climaxed, clamping her thighs around his head. Astra's body trembled. An occasional aftershock ripped through her, making her flinch and jerk in his arms. Chapter 19. Kane wrapped his arms around her, holding her while she had an occasional orgasm-fueled aftershock convulsion. Staring into the fire, he marveled at the way her body had responded to him, the way her curves fit in his arms. After the fourth or fifth aftershock, he glanced down. Silent tears were drifting down her cheeks. Her eyes were open, the red and orange flames enhancing their crystal green depths, giving her an otherworldly look.
"Why are you crying?"
He ran his thumb pad over one tear, trailing it down her face, rubbing it away, wishing he could rub away whatever was causing her pain in the same way. Astra shook her head.
"You don't want to tell me?"
He wouldn't lie. A part of him was crushed that she didn't want to share. At the same time, how could he blame her? They barely knew each other. "No, I'll tell you. I'm just not sure. Not really. Not exactly."
Women.
He'd never understand them, and he suspected that Astra would be harder to understand than most. She sucked a deep, ragged breath in, then released it. "Is this why you wanted me to come in?"
"This and so much more for many years, for forever."
A part of him wanted to tell her. That would freak her out, though. How could he explain the feelings he'd developed for her? They were too sudden, though he felt like she was the missing piece of a puzzle that he'd spent eternity looking for.
"Is that what you think? That I brought you in here to get some pussy?"
She gasped at the severity of his tone and words. He hadn't meant to come across that harsh, but damn it, couldn't she see this was so much more than that? He'd vowed to himself he would not take her. He would not make her his until she asked him for it.
"I'm sorry."
He picked her up, carried her to the sofa, laid her on it, then covered her with a blanket. "I'm not that kind of girl to do this with strangers," she began. Was she worried he'd judge her? Was that what this was about?
"I know."
He was thankful the sofa was extra large and long. He planted his body alongside hers, but above the blanket to keep temptation at bay. "Why did you want me to come inside?" She bit down on her perfect, generous lower lip, as if the answer worried her. Outside, the wind was raging, while the inside of the cabin remained a warm refuge in more ways than one. His bear growled, deep within Kane's mind, urgently issuing a warning.
"Of what?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you."
Kane put a hand on her hair, twirled it around his fingertip.
"How did you know I was a shifter?"
Tear-filled eyes rose to his. "I saw it, felt it. It's hard to describe."
"What do you mean?"
"You had the same thing that Grant and Doc have, that energy thing that I feel, that glow that comes from you." With a finger on her chin, he tipped her head back.
"That's not what people do, normal people."
Anger flashed in her eyes. "What the hell does that mean? Are you saying I'm not normal?"
"No, I'm saying that you're..."
A deep rumbling shook the cabin, a deafening cracking sound, almost like lightning. Then a roller coaster feeling surged through Kane's body. His bear roared its warning again. Astra's eyes widened, her mouth forming a perfect O. Outside, a loud crashing sound came from the driveway, or mountainside, or both.
"Damn,"
he uttered. "Avalanche," she whispered. Chapter 20.
"I'll be back. Let me go check."
In a swift motion, Kane rose from the sofa and slipped out the door before Astra could tell him to get a coat. She rose, wrapped the blanket around her, and went to the shuttered window facing the driveway. Opening the shutter, she watched him shift into a massive, beautiful grizzly loping toward the road. She shook her head in disbelief. She'd slept with a shifter. She, who hated shifters, had slept with a shifter. And what's more, there was something about him that had drawn her to him. An undeniable force, as if they'd known each other a long time, had drawn her to him.
"It's not just sex,"
she told herself.
"There's no way. I've had just sex before, and this isn't it. This was so much more than sex."
What was he about to tell her? She watched the snow whirling, worried about him as the minutes passed. Then she heard another loud crash. The cabin floor trembled beneath her bare feet. Still no sign of Kane. That did it. She was going to find him. She ran to her clothing, throwing the blanket aside. She shoved her feet into her pants and drew her coat on over her bra without bothering with her top. She pulled one boot on and was just starting on the second when the door flew open. Red-cheeked and breathing deeply, Kane had a very worried look on his face. Chapter 21. Astra's face was pale.
"What is it?"
Kane drew a deep breath.
"Your Jeep. It's not exactly where we left it."
He noticed she'd dressed.
"It's gone? Where?"
"About 30 feet down the mountainside, on the curve, on the road."
She breathed a sigh of relief. He hated that he had to break the rest of the news to her.
"It's upside down."
"Oh, no."
She closed the shutter.
"You're dressed. Where were you going?"
She blushed as if she was embarrassed by the reminder of what they'd just done.
"To look for you."
He bit back a smile of amusement at the thought of her trying to help a grizzly. That she'd believed he would need her help.
"What's so funny?"
Clearly, he'd failed at hiding his amusement.
"Nothing. I think it's cute."
He pulled her close to him and took her coat off her, enjoying the view of her body, the swell of her breasts, the hips that curved just right for loving.
"You don't need to worry. We'll get someone up here to help with the Jeep. You won't have to be trapped here for days on end."
He thought he saw a shard of disappointment in her eyes. He hoped that's what it was.
"Maybe you'll be stuck with me for a couple days, though? That's not so bad, is it?"
He pulled her close to snuggle against him, fully intent on carrying her to the bed and doing more of the things his bear was demanding that he do. Her jaw was set, a steely glint in her eyes.
Uh-oh.
This wasn't a woman who wanted to be cuddled.
"What were you saying before you left?"
"About you being... Are you sure you want to hear it from me? You should hear this sort of thing from Doc, or May, or maybe even Grant. They do know that you can discern shifters, right?"
She shook her head tentatively.
"Not exactly."
Her voice was low, like she was ashamed that she'd never told anyone. He rubbed his jaw.
"Shit."
This wasn't for him to reveal. Doc should have discussed it with her. But how could he have if she'd never told him?
"So, no one else knows that you can feel shifters?"
Another ashamed headshake from Astra.
"Look, that's an inherited trait, mother to daughter. I don't know if it skips a generation. What about your mother?"
"I was young when she died. I don't think she ever told me about it."
Her phone buzzed. Kane picked it up, looked at the screen, and handed it to her.
It's May, probably worried. You should tell her you're okay and tell her I'll take care of you."
Astra pressed on the screen. "May?" Astra's voice sounded brave, but Kane could see the naked vulnerability on her face and wondered if May would be fooled. "I'm fine. I'm with Kane. The Jeep isn't quite okay, though. Maybe when the storm stops and the roads are good to go, Grant and Doc could come up. We may need some help with the Jeep, or at the very least, a ride back." Kane didn't have the heart to tell her that if she was leaving, he wasn't going with her. He couldn't afford to bring danger to her. It already bothered him that she was here with him, now that he thought about it.
Foolhardy of me to bring her here. Selfish. I shouldn't have brought her with me. If the Rovers show up.
He quit beating himself up over it. Of course the Rovers wouldn't show. He'd done a good job of concealing his trail. "Bye." Astra pressed to end the call, then shook her head. "I need to talk to Doc. He'll have the answers." She looked at her phone. "I can't call him now. My battery is low and I don't have my charger. And even if I did, there's no freaking electricity here." Her brows dipped in a frown.
"There's no rush to get answers. We can chill here for a while."
He took her hand, indicated the bed with his head. "The bed? Really?" She tilted her head.
"No, the sofa is fine, if you'd prefer. I don't really want to stand up and talk. So it's the bed, the sofa, or the kitchen chairs. It's a one-room cabin. There are no other options."
She studied him as if she was trying to gauge his intent, then nodded and pulled him toward the sofa. He shrugged and scooped the blanket off the floor. She sat in the middle of the sofa, and he took one side, leaning back against the padded arm. At least Grant's cabin had a nice plush sofa, even if he didn't have electricity here. Kane wrapped her in the blanket.
"Why do you hate shifters so much, particularly when you're related to one, and clearly have connections that are otherworldly and allow you to feel our presence?"
She leaned back, her back against his chest. He adjusted, moving a bit, because the contact between them brought his cock to attention, and he didn't need her to accuse him of just wanting to fuck her. Though God knew he did want to, in the worst of ways. She was quiet for so long that he leaned forward to see if her eyes were open, to ascertain if she was still awake. She shifted her head so she could look up at him from over her shoulder. "They killed my mother. That's reason enough." She paused mid-word, gasped. "They killed Anya."
"Who's that?"
She shook her head slowly, rubbing it back and forth across his chest. Her hair flowed over his forearm, tantalizing him with its scent. A scent of vanilla and lavender. He inhaled deeply, allowing that and her essence to sit in his lungs. "My best friend." She sat up abruptly, facing him, delectable in her bra and jeans, her hair wild around her face. "I forgot all about her. God, how did I do that? All these years, I've never had a thought about her."
"What happened to her?"
Kane pulled Astra back down against his body. "When my mother was being attacked, Anya jumped to defend her, shifting into a tiger." "Oh my gosh, my best friend was a tiger shifter?" A half-sob erupted from her throat. "Oh no, why have I not remembered this until now? I'm horrible. I haven't even thought about her."
"You probably blocked all of it."
He murmured soothing sounds to calm her, wrapping his arms around her. Astra shook her head as though she was refusing to accept his answer. "Anya fought with this huge bear. Then she fell, and Doc and Grant came. They killed the shifter that attacked my mom." Astra's voice was anguished, and tears welled in her eyes. She was fighting them back. "My mother was lying there bleeding. What happened to the other shifter? Didn't I see two? Why can't I remember?" Astra rubbed her forehead as if she could bring the memories closer to the forefront.
"I'd say you remembered a whole hell of a lot. I don't think you need to be so hard on yourself. Trauma makes people forget things. It's a coping mechanism."
He pulled her closer into an embrace. Astra lay still, unmoving. Her pulse slowed and sleep took over. She slumbered deeply, and the only thing that moved was her chest as she breathed. The fire began to wane. He needed to stoke it, add some wood, but he didn't want to wake her. Shifting into bear form, he kept her snuggled against his warm fur. His bear nuzzled his muzzle against her neck and shoulder, taking in her scent. They remained that way until the fire was almost completely embers and ash. In her sleep, Astra screamed, the sound reverberating against the cabin walls, bouncing off of them, an offense to Kane's sensitive bear hearing. He shifted quickly before she could find him as a bear and held her close. Chapter 22. Astra's eyes flew open. She was a young child again, hearing snarls and screams. For a second, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw Kane's face, his jet black eyes full of concern and care for her. She'd switched position in her sleep, moving, turning, so that now she was huddled against his chest. She buried her face into his neck, inhaling him, breathing his comfort and security in deep.
I had the dream. This is the first time I've ever been able to remember it when I woke up.
She shook her head to clear away the cobwebs.
Well, partially remember it anyway.
She shivered.
The fire went out. I didn't want to wake you by working on it.
Kane planted a kiss on her temple, his lips lingering as they finally pulled away, leaving a coldness behind where her flesh missed his already.
Are you okay?
She nodded.
That's the first time. I need to. I'm so confused.
Relax. You'll talk to Doc when the weather breaks and we can get you back home.
It hit her. He was planning to go. And what hit her even harder was that she didn't want him to go. Ever.
Where the hell did that come from?
Tell me about you. She let her lips touch the forearm that was holding her, hoping that he didn't notice that she'd been so bold, though a part of her wanted to be so much bolder than that.
Not much to tell. Lived in Texas for a long time. Looking to live somewhere else. I've never really put roots down.
His ruggedly handsome face took on a scowl, his eyebrows dropping into a frown.
What was that about? That frown?
Chapter 23. Kane didn't feel like getting into it. He'd been adrift most of his life. He didn't have much to show for what he'd done. Sure, he had some money. Who wouldn't after being alive for so long? But it wasn't anything he wanted to relive.
Nothing. Just not much to share.
He forced a smile to his face. He'd so much rather talk about her. She was the interesting one, and she was a seer. Surely Doc knew. Grant had to have known, too. Why wouldn't they tell her? He wondered if her mother had been one. If she had been, then they'd have known.
Okay, if you won't talk about that, then tell me why you're on the run.
He ticked off a finger.
I'm being hunted.
He ticked a second finger.
I'm outnumbered.
A third finger.
And I'm not interested in finding out how many shifters I can take out before they kill me.
He hoped he wouldn't have to find out.
Why are you being hunted?
I ran across a couple of shifters accosting another one. A smaller shifter. I haven't confirmed it because I'm not likely to have a friendly conversation with them, but I think they were trying to kidnap her.
Why would they kidnap her?
All sorts of reasons. Selling her, keeping her as a pet, using her for ransom, a territory dispute, who the hell knows? All I knew was that it wasn't a fair fight, so I evened the odds up a bit, except one of them ended up dead. The other ran off, and now here I am on the run with a bounty on my head.
So I could make some money if I told anyone your whereabouts?
She cut a sideways glance his way, a smile on her face. He was happy to see her smiling. The way that dream, nightmare, had affected her had bothered him. He was worried that the dream would ruin their evening.
Sure. Maybe. Why? Do you need some money?
He joked back.
No, I think Doc is doing pretty well.
Her fingertip was making circle patterns on his shirt, and it was about to drive him crazy. Did she not realize what she was doing to him? Chapter 24. Astra pushed the dream away from the forefront of her mind. That wasn't hard to do because being this close to Kane was a definite distraction.
So, your turn,
he said. Her mind went to what he had done, the way he had feasted on her. My turn? Was he expecting her to feast on him? To pleasure him with her mouth? Not that she minded, but that was pretty damned forward. The thought of taking him in her mouth fueled a rush of desire that ran through her body with the subtleness of dynamite.
Your turn to talk about yourself. I want to know more about you.
His voice was like a cup of hot chocolate, warming her from the inside. Not much more to tell. Doc moved us away. We buried Mom in Florida and lived there until a few months ago.
What brought you back here? A place that holds so much pain for both of you.
She tilted her head, pondering his question, her desire for him in the background, though it purred deep within. Doc brought us back. Why? He shrugged, large chest and massive shoulders flexing beneath her, like a sheet of metal covered with flesh.
Just wondering, are you happy to be back?
You're the inquisitive one. I don't know. Can we not talk any longer? She didn't want to be the topic of discussion anymore.
What would you prefer we do?
While his question was covertly suggestive, the look in his eyes was blatant with lust. Astra licked her lower lip, contemplating whether she had the nerve to do what she wanted to do. If she didn't, she wasn't sure she'd ever have that chance again, especially if he left the valley for good, which was what it sounded like he was planning. And I'm disappointed? Why? Isn't this what I wanted from the moment I saw him? She traveled her finger down the length of his t-shirt, where she knew his treasure trail led directly to the very treasure that sparked her curiosity. He took a deep breath, his chest filling, pushing the shirt out, the muscles beneath it sharply defined. When she reached the waistband of his jeans, she pulled his shirt out, revealing dusky flesh and the downy fur that led downward. He groaned, spurring her into a forwardness. She shoved her hand into his jeans. His cock, a hard, thick, hot shaft, pushed against her palm. She wrapped her fingers around it. It's now or never while you have the nerve, girl. She talked herself into what she wanted to do more than anything at that moment. She squeezed him between her fingers and palm.
Astra.
He growled her name. His response was the fuel her fire needed. His head dipped, his mouth closing on her neck, his teeth nipping, his tongue licking, reminding her of all the things he'd done to her earlier. He made a noise, somewhere between her name and another rumbled growl. She unzipped his pants, unbuttoned them, and released his thick, mushroom-headed velvetiness from his boxer brief confines. When her fingers wrapped around it again, Kane's hand wrapped around hers, his grip tight, his head thrown back. She lowered her body, shifting downward, wiggling until her head was poised and her mouth perfectly lined up, her ass in the air, still in her jeans. She opened her mouth fully, taking him in, just the head, marveling at how thick he was and how long. She lowered her head, driving him deeper into her mouth. Astra tried to open her mouth wider, barely able to take enough of him in, definitely not as much as she wanted. She wrapped her fingers around the rest of him, stroking him upward and down while lifting and raising her head. His thickness rested against her tongue, the rise along the bottom of his cock pulsing, and she felt the buildup as it threatened to release. She knew he was fighting it, had been since he'd eaten her out earlier. He pushed her away.
Strip.
His voice was a demand.
Now, I need you naked. I need to be buried deep in your hot pussy, now.
She scrambled off of him to remove her jeans and her bra hastily, clumsily, her fingers hardly cooperating. He reached across, yanked her jeans down the rest of the way, and unhooked her bra.
"You're too slow, woman. I need you far too much for you to take your time."
He pulled her down so she was straddling his stomach. He struck swiftly, latching his mouth onto a nipple and sucking. She moaned. That was incredible. Her channel became even wetter, moisture traveling down, soaking his stomach. He trailed his finger over her abdomen, lower, over the tiny patch of hair she'd left behind, seeking her core. His finger found what it was looking for, sliding between her folds, centering on her clit. He parted her lips with one hand, his other flicking at her exposed core, rapidly beating a pulse into it. His mouth sucked harder on her nipple. Astra rose, giving him full access. She slid onto his finger and ground herself on the digit, gasping when he slid another in and curled it while he maintained steady, fast circular motions on her clit. Frantic unexpectedly, she began to rock and grind on his hand as a gush and a wave engulfed her in an orgasm. Just as she began an aftershock, he raised her up and dropped her onto his cock, impaling her with his thickness, stretching her while his fingers kept swiping at her clit. Another orgasm rocked her body, the intensity catching her off guard. She screamed his name and arched her back while he tugged on her nipple with one hand and pinched on her clit with the other. Her frantic movements became more intense. She rocked on his cock, moving up and down, relishing how thick he was even though each thrust spread her wide and pushed her channel to new limits. He lifted her again as if she was nothing and dropped her on his cock, pushing himself even deeper inside. She let out one last scream as she was seized by an overwhelming orgasm that threw her into an almost fetal position, then made her fling her arms out, her head back as she howled his name. Her eyes closed, and the blackness changed to thousands of light fragments.
"Fuck. God. I'm coming. Now."
The words were ripped from him as though he was held captive in a torture chamber, his voice tormented. He yanked her close and held her down, his shaft pulsing as his desire traveled the length of him, pulsating deep within her. Each of her convulsions pulled his cock deeper, tighter, demanding more of him to fill her. She dropped onto his chest, spent, lost, found, resplendent in feelings she'd never felt before. Chapter 25. Kane sighed. He was happy that she'd initiated their lovemaking, a session more intense and amazing than he thought it would be. His bear grumbled deep within that he hadn't marked her with the coupling bond. But Kane had no intention of doing that until she wanted to give herself to him fully. He knew Astra the same way he knew himself. It had to have come from her, and he would wait until it did, no matter how long that took. He wouldn't leave until she was his, fully, totally, claimed, marked. He carried her to the bed, and she nuzzled against him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he'd rest, and he'd let her rest. If Doc and Grant came to collect her tomorrow, he'd have to figure something else out. He wasn't ready to let her go, and he wasn't ready to leave without her. Chapter 26. Astra's eyes opened to a blinding light. A huge fire was roaring in the fireplace. The shutters were open, allowing all of the sun's rays that bounced off the snow to enter the cabin and shine right in her face. She looked around. "Kane?"
"Here."
He poked his head around the partial wall that blocked the stove from view.
"Found a few things. How do pancakes and syrup sound? No butter."
He raised his shoulders in a shrug.
"Sorry."
They smelled great, with or without butter. "I'm in." She gave him a smile. "A man who cooks breakfast? You may be worth keeping around. What's the weather like out there?"
"It's not really breakfast. We slept way in. It's afternoon, 2 o'clock to be precise."
"No way. Oh, shit! I bet Doc's worried." She scrambled up to find her phone.
He called, May called, Grant called. I've talked to all of them, assured them we were fine. They said they were going to come up later this afternoon.
A feeling of sadness rushed through her. The surreal fun she'd had playing couple with Kane was coming to an end. She bit on her lip, chewing on it, and she hadn't even gotten to her original agenda to get him to leave. An agenda she didn't want to fulfill anymore. That's good.
You don't sound too happy.
Kane raised a brow, cocked his head.
What gives?
She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to go into how she was starting to feel about him. She felt stupid, foolish. How could she explain starting to care for someone she had just met? How could she explain that there was something about him that just clicked in a big way? That was stupid teenage bullshit, wasn't it? No, it's not. But who would believe it anyway? She wasn't sure she believed it herself.
When do you want to talk about this?
He asked her. This? This what? He pointed at her, himself, and her, his hand waving back and forth.
This.
What about it? She leaned against the kitchen table. The same table that he'd made her orgasm on the first time.
You can't deny the connection. Surely you don't deny that.
There was a vehemence in his voice, a passion. Astra didn't want to get her hopes up. There's a connection, she began tentatively, uncertain where to go next.
There's something between us that transcends time. It's like I've always known you. I can't let you leave my life. I don't know how.
He raked his fingers through his hair, his black eyes haunted.
I can't let this go.
I'm confused.
Is it because of the seeing thing? Being a seer or witch or whatever?
Her head snapped in his direction. What?
You. The ability to see shifters.
She jammed her fists onto her hips. I'm not a damned witch. Witches do magic and cast spells. What the hell? Just because I can see a shifter.
You do more than just see them. That's a power, and it's one you didn't know you had. And as far as you know, no one else knows you have it.
A crashing sound made them turn away from each other and turn toward the door. What do you think that was? It didn't sound too close. Kane cocked his head, listening. He put his hands on her shoulders.
Stay here. Don't come out for any reason, for anyone, unless it's...
He shook his head.
Unless it's someone you trust, or me.
But I do trust you. You are someone I trust. He leaned down, placing his lips on hers, feather light.
Stay here.
But... He put a finger on her lips.
Please, stay.
Chapter 27. Kane didn't want to tell her, but in the distance he could hear growling. Something was up. He shifted as he loped, picking up speed, running as fast as he could. He identified several sources, at least 3 shifters, maybe 4. And they were in the midst of a battle. He could tell from the howls of pain and the roars of anger. There, past the driveway, down the mountainside a few dozen yards, not far from where the fallen Jeep had landed. Blood spatters marked the snow, and the tracks of bears were noticeable long before he could see who it was. Many tracks. When he reached the edge of the road, he could see that in the clearing there were 4 shifters in the midst of a scuffle. No, that wasn't a scuffle. That was a battle of giants, and he was wrong. It was 5 shifters. He recognized Grant, and there was one fighting with Grant. That had to be Doc. The other 3? Those were the Rovers.
Damn.
They'd found him. He barreled their way, heading into the midst of the roaring open jaws, exposed canines, and rapier-sharp claws. He saw the one fighting alongside Grant falter, then fall. It was Doc. Doc had fallen. The 3 Rovers pounced on Grant, pounding at him, piercing his flesh with their sharp teeth and razor-sharp claws. With a mighty roar, Kane flew their way as fast as his body would allow, pushing his lungs to new limits, feeling a burn deep in his chest from the exertion. He reached the first shifter just as the rover turned to greet him with outstretched claws. Kane reared his head back and aimed his paw for the rover's throat, aiming to slice his jugular. The rover backed up, ducked, and then cut under Kane, piercing his hide, slicing into his thigh muscle. The other two shifters were on Grant, pummeling him with their claws, shredding his flesh. Kane misstepped, his sliced muscle betraying him. He flexed the muscle and shot his paw out, his claws unsheathed, and caught the rover in the arm, almost severing his limb. The rover roared. One of the other rovers then noticed it was Kane who was attacking them. A snarl and a leap later, he had pounced on Kane, shredding Kane's back with his claws. A woman's scream penetrated through the growls and snarls.
Astra, damnation.
He couldn't yell at her to get to safety. She disobeyed him. She wouldn't stand a chance with the rovers. One of the rovers glanced at her as if he was assessing who she was. Kane roared for the rover's attention. The rover had a wicked glint in his ursine eyes. Kane shifted into human form.
Get in the car,
he yelled at Astra, knowing full well that the Jeep wouldn't be bear-proof, but at least it would buy her some time. The rover next to him slashed at Kane's already wounded leg. Kane shifted, becoming a bear once more, knowing he was draining his strength from shifting so much. He roared as he took the rover on with renewed fervor, glancing at Astra to be sure she'd gotten to safety. She hadn't. She was paralyzed with fear, her gaze locked on the fallen Doc. Kane growled in frustration. As if she realized that, Astra finally moved. As though she was moving through quicksand, she took off for the Jeep. One of the two rovers attacking Grant turned his head, once more interested in Astra. He moved in her direction at a dead run. Kane had to intercept him. Escaping the clutches of the first rover, Kane took off after the second. He was on him before the shifter could reach Astra. She managed to open the door on the upside-down Jeep and climb inside. The other shifter reached Kane, sliding into him, knocking him under the first one. From the vehicle, he heard Astra's scream, piercing the day's cold, making him wonder if that was the last time he'd ever hear her voice. Chapter 28. Astra couldn't breathe. Panic and exertion had robbed her of her air supply. Her lungs wouldn't work. She scrambled in the upside-down vehicle. Her pistol was somewhere in the back. Only the back was. Everything was weird when it was upside down. There it was, the bag with the pistol. She scrambled toward it, turning her head often to look at the fight. Kane was down. She had to help him. In the back of her mind, she knew her pistol wouldn't affect the bears much more than a bee sting would affect a man, but still, she could hope it would cause enough of a diversion to give the men a chance. Doc had fallen. She bit back a sob, praying that he was alive. He had to be. What had Grant said about it? They had to be separated from their bear. Decapitation or... Damn it! Why couldn't she remember shit? Pistol in hand, she opened the door of the Jeep and got out, trying to fight the dizziness that had set in from evading a rover and bouncing around in the Jeep while she looked for the pistol. She aimed the pistol. Which one was Kane? There he was. She could shoot the rover. Then she saw another rover in a struggle with Grant. But Kane was fighting too. She should help him. Grant was almost down, though. She needed to act. Now. She aimed for the one that was fighting Grant and took a shot. The bear yelped and released a snarl. She turned the pistol toward one of the two who were attacking Kane. It was headed her way. Jesus! She took aim, shot. The bear shrugged as if the round hadn't affected him, then resumed its course in her direction. She shot again. Another shrug, dismissing the pistol's rounds as if they weren't more than a mosquito bite. Kane saw the shifter coming toward her and roared, then scrambled to catch up. Astra backed up as if that would do any good. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow emerge from the forest, a shadow that was camouflaged well into the forest's white and black colors. The shadow flew toward them in a mighty leap, landing on a rover closest to her. It raised enormous paws, slashing at the rover. A white tiger! A massive white tiger was attacking the rover. Blood spurted from the impact of the large feline's claws, striking Astra in the torso, heading for her face. She turned her head just before the crimson spray could reach her eyes. The cat surged toward the bear and leapt onto its back, its massive jaws holding the bear captive. The white tiger shook its head, and the bear squealed in pain, roaring in agony, while the cat slowly sliced through tendons, muscle, and bone, shaking its mighty head in a motion that made the bear's head separate from its body, only held in place by a thin tendon. The tiger leapt off the effectively dead rover and pounced for the one that engaged Kane in battle. Doc stumbled to his feet. Tears formed in Astra's eyes, preventing her from seeing anything clearly. Doc was alive. She hadn't lost him. Oh, thank God, she thought, barely able to breathe. Doc joined Grant in the battle with the rover, while Kane and the white tiger made short work of the other rover, rendering it headless in just a few moments. Astra flinched at the sight. When the only living rover saw that it was alone and greatly outnumbered, it bounced off into the forest. The white tiger took off after it, and moments later, terrible howls tore through the woods. Kane, Doc, and Grant shifted into human form, covered in wounds and blood, skin shredded. Astra ran to Doc and flung her arms around him, her head on his chest.
I thought I'd lost you. You're the only father I have. Don't you dare leave me.
Doc patted her shoulder while she inhaled his scent, thrilled and relieved that he was alive. His shifter energy reverberated in her, a rumble that she wasn't going to ignore or hide anymore. She looked at Kane. Relief flooded his eyes.
You worried me,
he said softly. Doc held out a hand.
You must be Kane. I've heard about you.
Kane shook it.
I hope it wasn't all bad. Not all of it.
Doc smiled. The white tiger bounded out of the forest, coming to a stop in front of them, and snow flew upward as his paws hit the ground. He shifted to a dark-haired, dark-eyed man.
Vax,
Kane said. A dangerous smile appeared on the tiger shifter's handsome face.
Kane,
he said, stepping into Kane's personal space. Kane put an arm out, and they exchanged a solid shoulder hug.
Good to see you alive,
Vax said. He turned his intense gaze on Astra, Grant, and Doc.
I'm Vax.
Astra didn't say a word. She'd gone from knowing two shifters to a shifter battle, and now she'd met another shifter. At least this one seemed to be on their side. Doc squeezed her harder, as though to comfort her in this time of sensory overload, then looked down at her, smiling. Grant studied the two of them for a moment, then turned toward Kane and Vax.
Welcome.
He extended a hand to the tiger shifter.
And thanks.
Vax nodded.
It was the least I could do, considering this one.
He pointed to Kane.
Saved my sister's life. Of course, that put a hell of a bullseye on him. They followed him across several states to kill him. There's probably a nice bounty on your head.
Kane nodded.
I'd say we're pretty even now. No, I'd say now I owe you. You'll tell May I said hi, okay?
Vax took a step back. Wait! Astra couldn't believe it. The shifter had come out of nowhere, had saved lives, helped them win the scuffle, and now he was just going to leave? She wanted answers. Where? She stopped mid-sentence. What he did was really none of her business, but she was curious. And he was a tiger shifter. Did tiger shifters know other tiger shifters? How did Vax know May? She was confused. There seemed to be a network that she knew nothing about, even though her father was a shifter. What? Vax paused and turned back their way.
I run a place in Texas. I've been gone for a few days following him.
He nodded toward Kane.
I wanted to make sure he came out of this unscathed. I called May to let her look out for him.
Kane laughed.
Is that why you recommended I come through here?
Vax smiled.
At least I knew there were friendlies here, but mostly it was May's idea.
What kind of place? Astra couldn't contain her curiosity. What kind of place do you run?
It's called After Dark.
Vax's tone was indulgent.
If you're in Texas sometime, have Kane bring you by.
He said that as if she and Kane were a couple. Her head snapped toward Kane. He had a glint in his eye that reminded her of what they'd done earlier. She felt warm, even though she was standing in snow and freezing temperatures. She turned toward Doc and Grant, but she couldn't read their expressions. Was what she and Kane had between them that obvious? She looked down, embarrassed. Kane cleared his throat.
Sure, I'd love to visit sometime. It'd be good to see that troublemaking sister of yours.
Astra chewed on her lip. She wondered if that visit included her, then at the same time wondered why the hell she had wondered that. One day, she'd wanted him to get out of town, and now she didn't want him to get out of her life. I'm a mess.
We should get Astra home. She'd probably love a little less action and some electricity.
Doc glanced down at his hand. His scratches and wounds had mostly closed. It never ceased to amaze Astra how little wounds affected shifters. She glanced at the two dead shifters, their decapitated heads and gory bodies marring the once peaceful whiteness of the valley. What about those? She indicated the dead rovers.
I'll take care of that,
Grant said.
I'll call May. She's got a few options.
Astra looked at Kane, who was studying her silently, his expression unreadable. Was he leaving now? Was this it? It couldn't be. She didn't want it to be. She felt in her core that what they had was unfinished. Chapter 29. This was Kane's moment. He had to spend some time with her. He wasn't ready to let Astra leave his life. Except that her father, or at least the closest thing she had to a father, was ready to take her home. Would that be it if he did? And what about Grant? He was like her uncle. Kane had never been one to back down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to let her slip from his grasp.
Grant?
Might as well tackle the first part of the problem first.
About the cabin.
Kane shoved his hands into his front pockets and straightened his shoulders.
Mind if I stay a while longer?
Grant shook his head.
Not at all. Stay as long as you want, if you're still willing to. It's pretty bare and rustic.
Kane nodded his thanks and turned to Astra. Her eyes were clear, that beautiful light green that looked like dew on grass, reflecting light through the green blades. He turned his gaze to Doc, then back to Astra.
I was hoping to have company.
His bear felt her pulse quicken, and it made Kane's quicken too. A glimmer lit her eyes. She crossed her arms over her chest. Anyone in particular, Shifter? A smile threatened to erupt, but she managed to contain it. Kane looked at Doc.
If you don't mind.
He put his hand out to Astra. Astra took his hand, hers tiny in his grip. He pulled her close, making it clear he would protect her. He would always protect her if she'd agree. Doc nodded sagely, understanding. She leaned in, her back against his chest and abdomen, and he wrapped his arms around her. To think this woman was willing to risk death at the hands of rovers to save the ones she loved, and him. He hoped she was developing those kinds of feelings for him. He knew he was, and so was the bear. The bear growled.
Fine.
The bear had known first. Kane agreed.
But I wasn't far behind.
The bear reverberated a satisfied rumble deep in the recesses of Kane's mind. Dad? Astra's voice burst with confidence and strength. That okay? She reached for his hand. Doc leaned forward and planted a kiss on her forehead.
I shouldn't be surprised. You can't be my little girl forever.
I have some questions. Astra tensed in Kane's embrace, turning a glittering gaze on Doc and Grant. He knew she had a lot of questions, her recent memories of her earlier life, knowing that she was special and could see shifters. Yes, Kane acknowledged. His woman would have questions.
They can wait for now,
he told her. Chapter 30. Doc and Grant left with promises to send Joe and a wrecker up with Doc's truck for them to use and to take her Jeep away to be fixed. They said they'd send groceries and a cooler with Joe. What more could a girl want? Chocolate, she murmured to Doc, knowing that no matter how much she lowered her voice, Kane and his bear would hear. She caught the smile on his full lips, and if Doc hadn't been there, she'd have done a lot of things. In the warmth of the cabin, sheltered from a chilly wind and the world's worries, Astra nuzzled Kane's chest, the top of her head tucked in under his chin. Kane stirred the spaghetti with one hand. His other hand was cupping her ass, pulling her close. The sauce bubbled in a pan on the other burner. The last time she'd made spaghetti... Wow, it hadn't even been a week since the night she'd gotten the call from Grant to come by for dinner and examine the shifter she wanted nothing to do with. They'd been here 2 days, and her body was tingly, sore, numb, and pleasantly bruised in all the right places. She sighed, then breathed in deeply, inhaling his maleness, relishing his scent, desire stirring deep within her. She couldn't get enough of her man, and he didn't seem to be able to get enough of her. His hands were always on her curves, her hips, her shoulders, the small of her back. It was as if he couldn't stand to not hold or touch her. She could live like that forever. It was like she'd never known any other life but Kane. Everything she'd done and been had been overshadowed by the last couple of days with him. The phone buzzed on the counter. She'd kept it charged using Doc's truck, which Joe and the wrecker had dropped off for her. The Jeep was in the hands of Doc's capable mechanic in town, and the cooler was full of chocolate, along with a couple of beers and some perishable foods.
Ignore it,
Kane said, his lips against her temple, right at the hairline. He pressed her against the counter.
I have better things for you to do.
She tilted her head and gave him a flirty smile. Like what?
Strain the pasta.
He handed her the colander with a wicked smile. Is that all? She pressed her hand against his cock. Its hardness pushed back. In her own pants, her body buzzed and her panties became soaked. Her breasts swelled at the thought of his desire.
Fuck.
His voice was a low growl. He flipped the burner off.
Hold that thought and don't move your hand.
At all? Astra ran her hands up and down his steely length.
Don't move it away, but you can move it all you want.
He dropped the colander in the sink and poured the water and pasta in on top of it. He flipped the burner under the saucepan off, then grabbed her by the hips. Astra squealed, half in delight, half in anticipation and desire for this muscular hunk of a man. He shoved his tongue deep into her mouth, claiming her lips and tongue.
I want your pussy to hug my cock, but first it needs to hug my tongue.
Kane unzipped and removed her pants in one deft move, then rose and pulled her top over her head. He picked her up and carried her to the sofa, flipped her so she was facing away, and laid her over the arm face down. Astra heard the chair being dragged, and then her panties were pulled down over her hips, legs, and toes. She glanced over her shoulder. Kane was sitting in one of the chairs, his face level with her body, lust written across his olive complexion. He nudged her legs apart, spreading her wide. Cool air danced and played on her spread folds, making the moisture gathered even colder. Chapter 31. Kane had to taste her. As bad as he wanted to be in her, buried deep, as bad as he wanted to bond with her and mark her as his for eternity, his mouth watered at the thought of her essence and flavor. He wanted to rub his face in her folds, make her come all over him, and then kiss her so she could taste how amazing her flavor was. Astra moaned in anticipation, and her sounds drove Kane and his bear wild. The bear roared in Kane's head. He lowered his head to her inner thigh, let his lips feel the softness of her skin. His tongue glided over her flesh, goosebumps forming, and she shivered. He nipped the tender flesh gently. A flinch and her nether lips winking were his reward. The scent of her arousal wafted stronger. He parted her with his fingers, resisting the urge to plunge 2 fingers deep within, stretching and punishing her pussy. God, he couldn't wait to taste her. He licked a trail, starting at her clit and rising over her slit, all the way to her tiny rosebud opening. He flicked his tongue against her ass, then pressed her wider and flicked at the rosebud, watching it pucker.
I want to fill you up, every hole, everywhere. I want you to belong to me.
Astra sighed a moan. Her ass twitched and her hips pivoted and pushed her closer to his mouth. She pushed her ass upward, and he pulled her higher in the air, her knees on the arm of the sofa, her feet tucked under her thighs. He lowered his head, flicking at her clit with his tongue.
Do you belong to me?
Yes. Astra's hiss erupted from her lips. Totally. His heart raced that she'd accepted. Did she know what she was accepting? He had to make it clearer.
Are you ready for the couple bond?
God, yes, Kane. There's no one else. There never will be. He flicked her clit again with his tongue. She jerked upward, her feet striking his chest. Astra screamed his name. That was the fuel he needed.
Give me that sweet cream.
He thrust his tongue deep into her sex, enjoying the hugging of her channel. He licked her inside, plunging in and out of her. She pushed her body upward and screamed again, and her muscles tightened around his tongue, and she orgasmed on his face, leaving a fine coating of creaminess behind. He rubbed his face in her folds, pressing against her pussy. Her body quivered, and he moved his tongue faster, flicking her nerve center, striking the tiny bud with the tip of his tongue in quick succession. God! Kane! God! It's... Oh, God! Oh, yes! Now! Now! Without pause, she climaxed again, grinding her sex into his face. He relished every motion, every drop, sliding his face up and down, side to side, drenching it in her juices. He had to fuck her. His bear rumbled at the delay, and Kane growled alongside him. Rising, he slipped his pants down and released his cock, throbbing in his hand, his need for her painful, pushing him close to a threshold. Fuck me, Kane. Please, take me. His cock twitched in his hand as if it wanted to release immediately. He gritted his teeth against the overwhelming passion, trying to keep from coming.
Will you be mine?
He groaned the words out, running his hands up and down his throbbing cock, ready for her. God, yes, forever, she panted, her emotions clear in her voice. He pushed her legs apart even further, loving the way her curves displayed the red velvet for him, issuing a warm, wet invitation. He lined up his cock, sucked a deep breath in, and in one deep thrust, he was exactly where he needed to be. Forever. The bear in him roared as he grunted and pulled back, then pushed in again, driving with a force that was only matched by the intensity of his emotions. He thrust deep again, her channel gripping him, holding him tightly, the sensation so enveloping, so overwhelming, he felt a surge. Grabbing her hips, he pushed in deeper and was still. He didn't move for fear of allowing it to overwhelm him, to take him down a road of no return. He was sure, he knew that his only wish was to make her happy. She would complete his life. He had to know that she was equally sure, that she wanted him as much and for all the right reasons. The demands of a bear shifter's woman could be pronounced, especially with his bear.
Are you sure? I have to know you want me forever.
Chapter 32. Astra had never been surer of anything in her life. There was nothing that she'd ever wanted as much as this man. She didn't know why, but she didn't need a year or even a month to know that he was the one. Whatever came up, they'd work through it. She loved him in a way she never thought she could love.
Yes, Kane, I'm yours.
With a growl followed by a roar, he shoved in her deeply, stretching her. She felt his lips on her back, up high, then they climbed to the side of her neck, just where it met her shoulder. One tiny kiss, then the searing pain of his incisors dipping into her flesh, followed by the spurting of his release in her channel, hot fluid pulsing deep within her, while his mouth covered her wound, now slightly stinging. She moaned her pleasure and her pain, her very soul touched by his. Waves of passion flowed through her as her climax joined his. She felt their mingled fluids dripping down as he filled her, crowding the fluids out, driving them to drip down. She collapsed, her legs sliding out and extended. She stretched out, still perched on the sofa's arm. Kane lay against her, his fingertips running patterns on her shoulders.
"I love you,"
he said, his voice low, reverberating with emotion.
"I know it's early, but I think I've always loved you, as has my bear."
"This supernatural stuff is scary powerful," she agreed.
"Do you plan to reveal your skills? To do anything with them? I mean, publicly?"
His breath cooled the sweat-moistened skin on her back. She thought about it for a moment. "I'll talk about it with Doc and Grant, but I don't think so. I feel called to be a vet. I want to finish working on that." He planted a kiss over the patterns he'd been tracing on her skin, then rose off of her. She felt a loss, both physical and emotional, at his absence, even though he was still there with her. "Where are you going?"
"Your phone's been buzzing a text repeatedly. Someone is pretty persistent."
He took her hand and pulled her to a stand.
"I'll run you a bath. What do you say to the idea of my taking the tub to the front porch? How about soaking in the hot tub while you enjoy the mountain air?"
"If you keep on spoiling me, mister, I may not let you go."
"You better not."
He snarled at her, baring his teeth, more sexy than fearsome. He handed her the phone, adding,
"I'm thinking of buying some land out here, put a cabin on it, with electricity and other amenities."
That was all he said, then he looked at her, waiting. "Was there a question in there?" She planted her fists on her hips.
"Vixen."
He reached down and slipped his fingers between her legs, letting it rest between her folds.
"The question is, how does that work for you? Are you in?"
"All in." She moved her feet, stood with her legs apart, inviting him to take and do what he pleased. He slipped a finger inside, driving it in and out while she tried to enter the code that would unlock the phone. She couldn't manage. She kept getting the wrong code, her fingers fumbling, her mind concentrating on the sensations his fingers were delivering. She locked herself out of the phone. "Damn, now I'll have to wait to check it."
"Damn indeed."
He pushed on her back, bending her over. She reached for the counter while he took her higher and higher with his fingers, again and again and again, in mind-numbing, body-quivering orgasms. Chapter 33. The insistent text had been an invitation to dinner at Grant's. Kane's stomach grumbled with hunger, and Astra's did the same. They'd never gotten to the spaghetti. It had cooled, then hardened while they yielded to more pleasing pastimes. But now, hunger was kicking into high gear. Kane pressed his foot on the gas.
"I hope that Grant and Chelsea don't intend to have a long social visit before they set the table."
He pulled in, held the car door open for Astra, and before they could make it up the staircase to the front door, Grant opened it. Chelsea beamed a huge smile at them. May was behind them, also with a smile on her face. Astra felt like she was on the outside of a joke that everyone but her was privy to. She glanced at Kane. His face gave nothing away, so maybe he wasn't in on this, whatever this was. A few moments later, they all sat down at Grant's picnic-style table. Chelsea and May had put together quite a spread, a roast, potatoes, an apple pie, fresh bread. Astra thought of the last time she'd sat here, the attraction she'd felt for Kane, the animosity she'd felt toward shifters. So much had changed. She chanced to look at her hunky shifter. His gaze was focused on her face, and his expression told it all. He loved her, thoroughly and completely. His hand slid over her thigh and grasped her hand, enveloping her fingers in warmth and security. Doc watched them both, a happy expression on his face. He gave her a slow wink. She couldn't contain her curiosity any more. She felt like a child who had been invited to her own surprise party.
"So is everyone in on this? Am I the only one who doesn't know?"
May tried for an innocent look. Doc looked away, probably so she couldn't read his face. Chelsea giggled, her face turning a pretty blush pink. Grant's face was stoic. May gave in first.
"I had hoped that Kane would be good for you."
Kane put his hands around her shoulders, pulling her tight against him.
"Why?"
Astra couldn't think of anything else to say. May put her fork down, the bite still untouched on the tines.
"I've missed having shifters in Bear Canyon Valley. It's been lonely for far too long. Since Brad,
May's long-dead mate. Astra had heard about him from Doc.
It was time for us to be what we used to be, a valley teeming with shifters. I bought the B&B across from the salon. That's a good place to start the rebuilding."
She reached across the table, put her hand on Astra's.
"And you've been far too isolated and living inside yourself since you lost your mother. You needed something, someone. And Vax knew of Kane. I'd met Kane once when he was much younger. I'm not sure if he remembers."
She glanced at Kane. Kane shook his head.
"No, sorry." "I don't expect you to. You were young, and you had a lot going on in your life. But when Vax called and said you needed a place to stay, and possibly some help..."
May shrugged. Tears glistened in her eyes.
"It seemed the logical next step. I hoped it would turn out well."
At the mention of her mother, Astra couldn't help but think of all the questions she had.
"About my mother. Did you know her?"
"Of course," May said. "She was a dear friend of mine."
"Did you know about..."
Astra didn't know how to phrase it, or if she should phrase it at all.
"Her gift?"
May looked at Doc when she said that. Astra nodded.
"You have it, don't you?"
Doc asked.
"I wondered if you had it when I saw your reaction to Kane the first time you met him. All these years, I thought it had skipped a generation."
He shook his head.
"Maybe I hoped it had skipped a generation, if only to save your life."
Astra's head snapped in his direction.
"To save my life?"
"That's why the shifter hunted her down. Her gift made it impossible for shifters to hide their nature around her. It's a powerful and dangerous gift to have."
"I don't want it."
Astra was firm on that. All she wanted was to be an animal doctor. She didn't want to be involved with the supernatural beings, even if she was bonded to one.
"You don't have to use it."
Kane tucked a lock of her hair away from her face.
"You don't have to tell anyone you have it."
She bit her lip, worried it, chewing until she tasted blood.
Does anyone know about it?"
Grant looked at Doc. Doc turned to May. May shook her head slowly.
"I don't know. I'm thinking not. It's been more than a decade since your mom was taken from us. We haven't seen any signs of anyone suspecting."
Astra had another question.
"What about Anya?"
May's eyes widened.
"You remember?"
"She tried to help me and Mom. She didn't die."
"No."
A tender smile drifted across May's face.
"Anya didn't die, but the incident affected her. She withdrew from everyone for the most part, stayed hidden. She hasn't returned to the valley. I heard she went to Europe. The last time she was seen, she was with Vax's brother. Not with him, not like that, but they are cousins."
"I'd like to see her again one day. She was my best friend. I remember playing with her, getting rides on her back."
"I'll ask around. I've missed her too."
The pie was delicious, especially with a large scoop of French vanilla bean ice cream on it. Astra's tummy felt like it was going to burst. Her heart was equally brimming with satisfaction as she and Kane headed back to the cabin.
I forgot to tell Doc that we'd be buying some land. She frowned. I planned to tell him.
He knows. I mentioned to Grant that I wanted to buy some land, and Doc asked if you were involved in the equation.
Kane patted the bench seat's empty center. Astra scooched over, getting close to him, enjoying the feel of his muscular thighs against her curvy leg.
Happy?
Kane's voice was a satisfied rumble, starting deep in his chest. It reverberated in Astra's body.
Never been happier.
Kane knew exactly how she felt. He felt the same way. His nomadic ways were done. His heart and his bear had found a home. Epilogue. Astra looked at her hair in the mirror. She turned to Chelsea.
You're amazing, and the fact that you can concentrate on my hair when you've got so much going on to get ready for a wedding, that's just incredible.
Thanks. Chelsea spun Astra's chair back to facing her. It does look pretty stunning. You'll look beautiful at the wedding.
Getting the jitters?
Kelsey sat in the chair next to her at the empty station.
Chelsea is good, isn't she? Though I'm surprised her hands aren't shaking from the stress of the wedding preparations. The fridge in the back is full of ice cream, the perfect stress reliever. And May's busy with the new bed and breakfast.
Astra nodded. She'd never met May's distant cousin Kelsey before. Kelsey's two-tone blonde and brunette hairstyle looked cute on her. Astra was sure she couldn't pull it off herself. Kelsey kept talking.
Yeah. Am I crazy for agreeing to run it?
Chelsea gave them an indulgent smile and headed to the back. Astra wondered if she was getting some ice cream and almost asked her to bring back a couple of scoops.
Oh, what the hell?
Hey, bring me some too. In the back, Chelsea let out a guilty laugh.
Busted.
Kelsey leaned closer to Astra.
You know, I heard that the sheriff found a record on that guy, Jeff. That he'd changed his name a decade ago. He had a criminal record.
She leaned even closer, and the chair protested with a tiny squeak. Astra hoped it wouldn't give. The salon's chairs weren't meant to be leaned in this much. Kelsey's whisper was low and conspiratorial.
Murder and some kind of stalker violations. Oh my God. We're lucky that he left town before anything really bad could happen.
Astra had met Jeff twice in the time she'd been back in town. She'd never cared for him, had found him creepy, but now she knew he was a hell of a lot more than creepy.
Yeah, I heard he was bothering Chelsea quite a bit,
she said, unsure how much she should share with Kelsey, unsure if May had told her anything. The phone rang, disturbing the serenity of the salon. Astra jumped. May came out from the back to answer it. She spoke softly into the receiver, then hung up the phone and turned to Kelsey. That's the contractor I hired to redo the B&B. I want it to be phenomenal for the wedding. She turned to Astra. Maybe a double wedding? What are you and Kane waiting for?
You're kind of rushing it a bit, Astra laughed. We're enjoying each other. Let Chelsea and Grant have theirs, okay?
Sure. Okay, fine. There he is. She pointed. My new contractor, Teague. Kelsey gasped and paled. A hunk of a gorgeous man, dark-haired, dark-eyed, tall and muscular, stepped out of a pickup. He ran his fingers through his hair and pulled his jacket off, then strode toward the hair salon. Teague. Kelsey's words were a whisper. Yes, that's his name. May smiled. Astra studied the handsome man and the glow that emanated from him. Something vibrated deep in Astra. Another shifter in Bear Canyon Valley. This has been Seduction, Shifters Forever Worlds, written by Elle Thorne, narrated by Megan Kelly. Copyright 2015 by Elle Thorne. Production copyright 2017 by Elle Thorne.